Mr. Jones? Ms. Ross?
Ross votes aye.
Ms. Ross votes aye. Ms. Bush?
Bush votes aye.
Ms. Bush votes aye. Mr. Jordan? Mr. Jordan votes no. Mr. Shabbat?
How'd the chairman vote?
Chair
I'll vote
voted
no.
aye.
I'll vote no.
Mr. Shabbat votes no.
Thank you.
Mr. Gomert? Mr. Isa?
No.
Mr. Isa votes no. Mr. Buck? Mr. Gates? Mr. Johnson of Louisiana? Mr. Biggs? Mr. Biggs votes no. Mr. McClintock? Mr. McClintock votes no. Mr. Stubbe? Mr. Tiffany?
No.
Mr. Tiffany votes no. Mr. Massey? Mr. Roy? Mr. Roy votes no. Mr. Bishop?
No.
Mr. Bishop votes no. Ms. Fishbach?
No.
Ms. Fishbach votes no. Ms. Sparts? Mr. Fitzgerald? Mr. Bentz? Mr. Bentz votes no. Mr. Owens?
How is Swallow recorded?
Mr. Swalwell, you are not recorded.
Aye.
Mr. Swalwell votes aye.
How is Escobar recorded?
Ms. Escobar, you're not recorded.
Aye.
Ms. Escobar votes aye.
Recorded.
Mr. Correa, you were recorded as aye.
Thank you.
Has everybody who wishes to be recorded been recorded? Clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, there are 18 ayes and 10 noes.
18. The motion to table is adopted. Are there any further amendments? For what purpose does Mr. Roy seek recognition?
Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
I reserve a point of order.
Point of order. The point of order is reserved. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5460.
Without objection, the further reading is waived, and the gentleman is recognized.
Well, as I was making the point in the first amendment offered, and obviously I disagree based on my vote on the germaneness question, and wish we had addressed it, because if we had, I think it might obviate the need for maybe at least one or two more amendments, but because the committee is not making clear and now leaving it up to the regulatory body, and I think unclear, by the way, whether or not the regulations that currently apply to the two existing territories, I think it begs the question is whether they're going to have to do regulations for all three, because of the way the underlying bill is drafted. I just think it's ironic that the amendment is ruled non-germane when the language of the bill touches all three and again appears to read as if it's a strike and replace and deal with all three territories. But okay, we've made this ruling, so now we have not made clear by statute that we're going to not allow this to be put in place for recalcitrant countries, and those recalcitrant countries include a number of, actors who aren't always that friendly to us, including China. So it would have been preferred that we would have spoken as a body with statutory language making clear that China cannot avail themselves of this change to the law to the U.S. Virgin Islands, and as I believe, the other two territories as well. So, given that, I wanted to make clear that we, at least as a committee, would ensure that no alien who is a member or former member of the Chinese Communist Party may obtain the waiver. Now, we have had innumerable breaches of our national security, infiltrations of our intelligence, bad actions with respect to intellectual property, ongoing activities by the Chinese Communist Party in violation of human rights, enslaving people in China, engaging in activities to undermine our national security, engaging in activities to undermine our economic security. And this is a known and documented truth. In addition to very specific actions by Chinese nationals seeking to exploit our immigration system, which they do with regularity at our southern border. I don't have the stats right in front of me, but I'm pretty sure that this fiscal year we're somewhere around 400 Chinese nationals or something along those lines. I'm looking at my staff, you can quote me on the exact number, but it's a sizable number of Chinese nationals somewhere in that zip code that have been apprehended at our southern border. Now, that's not accounting, by the way, for the gotaways. The gotaways being the ones who are usually trying to slide through, which are usually your worst actors. So we do have an ongoing problem at our southern border. We have an ongoing problem with visa overstays, and we very clearly have a problem, as I read into the record in this committee a few hours ago, with Chinese nationals going to Guam, for example, and abusing the privileges there to have, I think, upwards of 1,000 births in one year period. This is an ongoing problem. I wish we had have addressed it in the First Amendment, but again, it's ruled not germane. So I just thought it would be good if this body says that we should make very clear that anyone who is a member or former member of the Chinese Communist Party, acting in direct contradiction to the well-being and the interests of the national security of the United States, I would argue, should not be able to obtain the waiver provided for in Section 212L of the Immigration Nationality Act. And with that, I would yield back.
Does the gentlelady insist on her point of order?
I do, Mr. Chairman. And this is problematic for the same reason some of the other amendments have been problematic, in that it amends 212L that includes the Northern Mariana Islands and Guam, which are not the subject of this bill. And I did overhear a spirited discussion between the lawyers, but we're going to take the advice of the parliamentarian on this, as we always do. Just if I may stray a bit, you may not be aware that Section 212A3D little I already prohibits someone who is affiliated with the communist or any other totalitarian party, subdivision, or affiliate thereof as inadmissible. One of the things, however, that Section 212 A3D specifies is that if it's involuntary membership, then it doesn't have to apply. And as we know, in some cases, some totalitarian cases, every person who needs to go to college is required to be a member. But I think in addition to being not germane, the amendment is also redundant when it comes to immigration law. So I do need to insist on my point of order, Mr. Chairman.
The amendment is not germane for the reasons stated, but it is redundant because the law already does what the amendment seeks to do by prohibiting, the existing law prohibits membership, voluntary membership. The existing law prohibits voluntary membership in any totalitarian party, which would include the Chinese Communist Party.
Specifically names the Communist Party.
Specifically names the Communist Party, so the amendment is redundant and out of order.
If I may respond with respect to the point of order, I guess is what we'd be on at this point, right? I mean, with the germaneness. On the substance, on a just digression on that, my understanding, though, is that that's for immigrant visas, not for that wouldn't apply with respect to the waiver.
No, it's admissibility grounds.
And then
it's admissibility, and therefore
immigrant visas.
It's admissibility, and therefore it applies all around.
But for immigrant visas,
yes,
even though you've got
yes,
because your waiver
not just for immigrant visas. For any visa.
And then it's, I mean, that's not how I would read that, and it's not my understanding. But in addition, it's not, there's a specific with the Chinese Communist Party or?
212A applies to all immigrants and non-immigrants, all those seeking entry.
And all totalitarian parties. which
Excludable
the com-
aliens is the title of this section.
And it applies to all totalitarian parties, which the Chinese Communist Party,
What specifies a Communist Party?
it specifies the Communist Party.
Right, but my understanding is because we changed it specifically to deal with visas, immigrant visas, and not to be applying broadly. That's my understanding of the law.
What it says in the very first sentence of 212, classes of aliens ineligible for visas or admission.
Right.
CBP makes the
DI, any
determination.
immigrant who is or has been a member. An immigrant defined as immigrant visa.
So it accomplishes what you want to do.
No, what I'm saying is I don't think it does.
It does.
I know, I do not believe it does. I need to enforce the vote.
It's not germane in any event, so, but it does accomplish,
Tell you what,
it's not necessary because it accomplishes, the current law accomplishes what you want, but the amendment is not germane in any event.
Well, what I'm going to do, because I want to go back to the first issue, is I will not demand a vote on that question.
Which question?
The question that we're currently debating, the
Germane.
germaneness of this Second Amendment.
So the amendment is ruled not germane.
But I have another amendment at the desk.
Oh, okay. So the amendment is not adopted. The gentleman is recognized, the gentleman has an amendment at the desk.
I reserve a point of order.
Point of order is reserved. Clerk will report the amendment. Do you have an amendment at the desk?
I do. Oh, they're giving her a copy of it. All right, there we go. The amendment is approaching the desk.
May it be speedy. Clerk will
Amendment,
report the amendment.
amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to HR 5460.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read, and the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
So despite my disagreement with the parliamentarian and the decision of the committee with respect to the germaneness of the First Amendment that I offered, we are prepared or are offering an amendment that specifies in the line in question that it is with respect to the U.S. Virgin Islands in order to be clear that it only applies to the U.S. Virgin Islands. I reiterate my belief that we ought to actually do it for all three because we've got a section, we've got a bill that addresses all three of the territories in its very text. But I won't relitigate that because it's already been litigated and voted on by the committee. So in response to the gentlelady's ruling and the vote by the committee, we're now offering that same amendment with respect to recalcitrant countries that I think there's some agreement here that statutorily it'd be good to just clarify and make clear the will of this body to ensure that those recalcitrant countries, which I've already talked about and already defined as being countries that are not always willing to work with us on the important matters of making decisions that we have to do when we're attempting to remove an alien and not work with us, China being one of those, that we could amend this language to say that it's with respect to the United States Virgin Islands in order to address the concerns that I believe were at the center of the parliamentarians' concerns and the lawyers of this committee. With that, I'll yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Does the gentlelady insist on her point of order?
No, I withdraw my point of order. I think he has made the amendment germane, but I would like to strike the last word.
The gentlelady is recognized.
I have, first of all, I question the 3 weeks because sometimes it can take longer than that to find out who is which, but I understand what the gentleman is trying to do. We've had in the past countries that refuse to accept people who we were trying to deport. And the Zedaius case that he mentioned does, the U.S. Supreme Court does prohibit the incarceration of individuals permanently who should be removed. And in many cases, these are individuals who are being removed because they committed a crime and they should be gone from the United States. I will say, I don't think this amendment probably has any effect because China is not included in the visa waiver program, and it's not going to be permitted under this bill either. And to my knowledge, I don't think any of the Caribbean nations, including Cuba, which is not one of the listed nations that would be considered for visa waiver, refuse to accept. But I think this is, it's redundant, really, because none of them are going to be, if this is the policy of a country, they're not going to be admitted into the visa waiver program in the Caribbean basin. I would note, just as a philosophical matter, we have gone back and forth, and this was bipartisan, on what would be the most effective remedy for recalcitrant countries, because those countries tend to be scofflaws internationally, maybe that's the best way to put it, and they may or may not care if there is hardship being visited on their ordinary people who want to be tourists. We've even thought about the most effective way would be to limit visas for their personal staff at their embassies and consulates in the United States. That's something that the decision makers would feel as compared to hardship placed upon individual members who just want to go on a vacation. But I don't object to this amendment, even though I don't think it has any impact on the bill before us. So I think we should just accept this amendment. Well, if we could change the 3 weeks.
No, we can't, because this could mean Vietnam, they have to take them back.
Oh,
Right, like,
the lawyers are actually pointing something out that I had overlooked, which is this would do something that is, which I'm sure the gentleman would not intend. There is a provision, and there was an agreement between the United States and Vietnam that we would not repatriate refugees who came before 1995, because they will go back and be persecuted by the communist government in Vietnam. And there was a move in the last administration to undo that and to start repatriating Vietnamese nationals who would then be persecuted. Can we do this, Mr. Roy? Can we, and I'll do this in good faith, can we work through some of these issues between now and the floor so that we don't have unintended consequences on this amendment?
If the gentlelady will work with us in good faith to make
Sure.
sure it's clear, and I will say, that language of 3 weeks was taken directly from the reg. So to the degree that there's a 3-week problem or there's some exception here with respect to Vietnamese that.
Let's
that we
work
didn't
through it.
intend,
Let's see if we
I'm
can work
happy to
through it.
See if we can statutorily make it clear.
Okay.
The amendment is then withdrawn. Are there any further amendments? Seeing no further amendments?
Do you want me to, I have an amendment at the desk.
Yes. Okay, the clerk will report the amendment.
I reserve a point of order.
Point of order is reserved.
The Mexican cartel one? Okay, but, so which one's at the desk? If the chairman would give us a second, I've got an amendment that I want to make consistent with what we'd already agreed to. So rather than going through a version that's not, I might say, if I could defer to the gentleman from Arizona so we can make some tweaks. All right.
For what purpose does Mr. Biggs seek recognition?
I reserve a point of order.
Point Clerk will report the amendment. Point of order is reserved.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5460, offered by Mr. Biggs of Arizona. Added the
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read, and the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment closes a loophole in our immigration laws.
You don't, is your mic on?
Oh, you know what? I'm talking from Mr. Johnson's mic, Mr. Chairman. His was off, mine was on. Thank you. The amendment will close a loophole in our immigration laws that encourages illegal aliens to bring children with them to the United States. Currently, because of the expansion of the Flores Settlement Agreement, DHS is unable to detain children who entered into the United States illegally with their parents for more than 20 days. This time limit is not found in the laws passed by Congress anywhere. It was imposed upon DHS by the courts. The 20-day limit serves as an incentive for family units to enter the country illegally or for aliens to enter as fraudulent family units. The INA is clear. Illegal aliens are required to be detained while their claims are pending. However, because of the expansion of the Flores Settlement Agreement, DHS is unable to detain families. My amendment will allow DHS to detain family units together for as long as necessary for potential claims to be heard by an immigration judge. Even the Obama-Biden administration opposed the expansion of the Flores Settlement Agreement. And I will point out just one anecdotal story of the 2019 surge. You will recall the 2019 surge, which was less than this current surge, actually. In that particular case, we saw so many fraudulent family units. And in one of my briefings down on the border, what had happened is they noticed that these individuals who were coming in family units were all, some reason, going to the same location in Charleston, South Carolina. And when they figured that out, they began investigating. It took, you know how it is, you had the local LEOs, you had the feds, and they all had to get together for a task force, and they found eventually a cartel running this operation, this human smuggling operation out of Charleston. They had a 12-year-old girl, and her job was to take care of the two little children. I can't remember the age, something along the lines of 3 and 5, 4 and 6, something like that. And the cartel member would take these children and send them and recycle them to form these fraudulent family units. The Flores settlement has been very detrimental and should be considered a part of this law. I urge members to support this amendment and join me in finally closing this loophole.
Mr. Chairman,
Does the gentlelady insist on her point of order?
I do, Mr. Chairman. This amendment does not even purport to amend the bill before us. It is amending a section of the William Wilberforce Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act of 2008, which I recall was a huge bipartisan effort to avert human trafficking, and it is not germane to this bill. It's to that section of the law.
Does the gentleman wish to be heard on the point of order?
I do, Mr. Chairman, if I may. On page 4 of the bill, section 4, factors, it says, in determining whether to grant or continue providing the waiver under this subsection to nationals of any country, the Secretary of Homeland Security, in consultation with the Secretary of Interior and the Secretary of State, shall consider all factors that the Secretary deems relevant, including, and then they give a few. They don't list them all. It's not an exhaustive list, but they list some, including electronic travel authorizations, procedures for reporting lost and stolen passports, repatriation of aliens, rates of refusal for non-immigrant visitor visas, overstays, exit systems, and information exchanges. I submit to you that the William Wilberforce law that that my amendment pertains to is integral in formulating any adjudication of the factors that would allow this program to continue. And there's no limitation on the factors. This is not an exhaustive list, and thus I would suggest to you that this amendment would be germane.
Mr. Chairman, that's a valiant effort, but on the Section 3, it identifies a section of law that is not before the committee, so I insist on my...
The chair is prepared to rule on the point of order. The point of order is valid. Clause 7 of House Rule 16 prohibits amendments that are on a subject matter different than the proposal that is under consideration. The subject of the bill we are currently considering is adding the Virgin Islands to the special visa waiver program for Guam and the Northern Mariana Islands. The gentleman's amendment has nothing whatsoever to do with Guam or the Northern Mariana Islands or adding that to the visa waiver program. It also amends a statute that is not amended by the bill, which is a subject different from what we are considering in this bill. The amendment, therefore, is not germane and violates Clause 7 of Rule 16. Are there further amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? If there are no further amendments...
I have an amendment at the desk.
I reserve a point of order.
The gentleman has an amendment at the desk. A point of order is reserved. Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5460, offered by Mr. Roy of Texas.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
I think my notes were happily picked up with some pile of papers here a second ago, but from memory, one of the key concerns raised by CBP and people expert on the matter is that the proximity of the U.S. Virgin Islands to the United States geographically poses some different concerns than we have with respect to the other territories. Those territories obviously being quite a deal farther away than is the U.S. Virgin Islands, obviously very proximate to Puerto Rico. So the goal here is that Border Patrol has raised the concern of exploitation of the visa waiver program with respect to drug trafficking and the possible use of the visa waiver program to move narcotics and have empowerment of cartels and so forth to exploit that, and then obviously then get to mainland United States from there, but obviously U.S. Virgin Islands. So we believe it would be helpful to ensure and clarify that any known member or former member of a Mexican drug cartel may be prohibited from obtaining the waiver that we're discussing here. And of course, this one has been amended despite my still existing objection to the underlying germaneness question with respect to to be specific to the U.S. Virgin Islands. And with that, I will yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Does the gentlelady insist on her point of order?
I do not. I do not. I believe that it's been amended to be germane, but I would like to strike the last.
The amendment, I'm sorry, the gentlelady does not insist on her point of order, but she's recognized to strike the last word for 5 minutes.
First, let me say that I don't think there's any disagreement among any of the members of the committee that we are opposed to the drug cartels and letting any of them come into the United States ever. However, I do think that there are some problems with the crafting of this amendment, and to some extent, it does overlook the provisions in the underlying bill. The authority the Secretary needs to exclude countries out of concerns relating to drug trafficking is amply provided for in the underlying bill. Prior to implementation, an adequate departure and arrival control system has to be in place so that the Department of Homeland Security can examine all individuals at the port of entry. And the Secretary can't authorize a country for a visa waiver program, including the Caribbean countries, if such a waiver would represent a threat to the welfare, safety, or security of the United States or territories or commonwealths, the Secretary is required to suspend a country if visitors from that country pose a risk to law enforcement of security interests. And I think everybody agrees, it's obvious that drug trafficking presents a risk to law enforcement and a threat to the security interests of the U.S. Virgin Islands. I would note also that in section 212A2C, there's ample and robust language prohibiting entry of those who are controlled substance traffickers. So the amendment is also redundant, and therefore I think since we have no definition of the Mexican drug cartels in the amendment, I think it would be wiser to pass on this amendment and rely on section 212A2C that has stood the test of time in terms of definition of drug-controlled substance traffickers. So understanding the good intentions of the amendment, I think we should pass on accepting it.
The gentlelady yields back?
Yes.
The gentlelady yields back. Does anyone else seek recognition on this amendment? If not, the question occurs on the amendment. For what purpose does Mr. McClintock seek recognition? The gentleman is recognized.
I hear the gentlelady's points. The point of the amendment is one that is to clarify for the regulators, which, without rehashing many of the arguments of the day, clearly there is concern on our side of the aisle about the relative level of seriousness that the current administration, and particularly the Secretary, is undertaking with respect to ensuring that we're taking all measures possible to limit bad actors entering the United States, but also particularly the reach of cartels. The purpose of this is not even just messaging, and I'd take to heart the question about the specific definition, but the point of the amendment is to just make clear that when we open up visa waivers, or when we use visa waivers and expand access to our country without visas, we're raising a whole lot of concerns, and this is one of those concerns, and Border Patrol has raised that concern. And so that's the purpose of the amendment. I understand the purpose, the point about existing language, but there's a lot of existing language in our current law that we don't see as being particularly strongly enforced, and believe that it was important to make, and it is important to make, very clear that a priority of the statute is to ensure that we don't have cartels or members of cartels entering the United States or being a beneficiary of this waiver.
I wonder, would the gentleman yield?
Well, I've got to yield back to him.
Oh, okay.
Reclaiming my time, I would also point out there is very robust language in the law that, among other things, requires that court-ordered deportations be enforced. Problem is, we have an administration that refuses to obey those laws. So the gentlelady's assurance that there's robust language protecting the sovereignty of the United States in these cases simply is unconvincing at this juncture in our history.
Would the gentleman yield?
Yeah.
Mr. Roy, I'm wondering, I'm not prepared to accept the amendment at this point for the reasons I've already discussed. But I do think that perhaps we could work together between now and the drafting of the committee report to make it clear, which I think it already is, but if there's doubt, that this issue and several others that have been raised should in fact be part of the consideration. I think they already are in the statute, but to emphasize that in the committee report, that they would be factors in the determination, if that helps you at all.
Yield to Mr. Roy.
If the gentlelady on this matter, as she has offered on the other matter, would agree to work in good faith to try to clarify that, I would be willing to not have a vote on the amendment, withdraw the amendment, again, pursuant to her word to work on it.
I will do that and work in good faith with you.
The amendment is withdrawn. Are there any other amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute?
Mr. Chairman,
What purpose does Mr. Biggs seek
I have
recognition?
an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
I reserve a point of order.
Point of order is reserved.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to
Without
HR.
objection, the amendment will be considered as read. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I'll point out that the TVPRA, William Wilberforce Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act, does apply to ports of entry, and that would be international airports and shipping and seaports like we would find in the U.S. Virgin Islands. Having been to the U.S. Virgin Islands, I can attest that they do have those seaports there. This amendment adds language to the bill that closes a loophole in our immigration law that requires unaccompanied alien children from non-contiguous countries to be treated differently than UACs from contiguous countries. The federal government is currently able to return UACs from contiguous countries back to their country of origin. However, UAC from non-contiguous countries are turned over to HHS and then subsequently released to sponsors. Many of the sponsors are the parent of the UAC who are in the country illegally. This disparate treatment is a pull factor for parents to send their children to this country illegally because they know that the children will be released and will most likely never be removed. So far, CBP has encountered nearly 60,000 UACs at the southwest border this calendar year. I recognize that I'm in danger of having my friend from California scuttle me again on a germaneness issue. And I just want to make and reiterate how important the TVPRA enforcement is. And with that, I'll withdraw my amendment.
He withdrew the amendment.
The amendment is withdrawn. Are there any further amendments?
Mr. Chairman.
Who seeks recognition?
Biggs.
For what purpose does Mr. Biggs seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk
I
will report
reserve
the
a point
amendment.
of order.
Point of order is reserved.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to HR 5460, offered by Mr. Biggs of Arizona, page 3, beginning on line 3, strike other than on the basis of an application for withholding of removal under section 241B3 of this act or under the Convention Against Torture, or an application for asylum if permitted under section 208 of this act, and insert other than on the basis of an application for withholding of removal under the Convention Against Torture.
Because it's been section 241B3, which is...
Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman is recognized to explain his amendment.
Thank you. My amendment removes language from the underlying bill that would allow aliens who visit the Virgin Islands as part of the new visa waiver program from being able to apply for withholding of removal or asylum. In a press release last September, the sponsor said, quote, this limited visa waiver, and she's iterated the same thoughts today, but this limited visa waiver program would better enable the Virgin Islands to compete economically with other islands and nations in the Caribbean community. The U.S. Virgin Islands must compete with other Caribbean islands for cruise ships, tourist visitors, and for the most competitive tourist attraction. This visa waiver program will lead to increased tourism, greater opportunities to host international events, and more support for our small businesses that have been hit very hard by the COVID-19 pandemic and impact on the travel and tourism industry. For example, the Virgin Islands annually host numerous yacht shows and regattas. However, due to the extensive visa acquirement process currently in place, participation and attendance is significantly lower in comparison to similar events in other Caribbean islands. Close quote. If the intent of this bill is to allow for economic development and to allow aliens to visit the Virgin Islands for a short period of time, then there is no reason to allow aliens who enter the Virgin Islands under the visa waiver program to be able to apply for withholding of removal or asylum. The memo that was prepared for this markup by the majority even claims that, quote, a visa waiver program is necessary to bolster the USVI's economic growth and increase the USVI's competitiveness against other Caribbean countries as a tourist destination, close quote. Again, if the bill is an economic development bill, then there should be no objection to my amendment, because we still allow someone who is claiming that they should not be removed under the Convention Against Torture, they can still make that application. But it would limit a broader scope here, and that's what I'm getting at. And we don't prevent tourists from visiting USVI, and we don't even prevent people who believe that they have a claim under the Convention Against Torture from applying for asylum. But if it is economic in nature, then my amendment is apropos and should be adopted. And I'll yield back to the gentleman, to the chair.
Does the gentlelady insist on her point of order?
I do, Mr. Chairman. As drafted, this would change the law for both the U.S. Virgin Islands, but also Guam and Northern Mariana Islands. And this, as we've discussed it on some other amendments, this bill is solely about the U.S. Virgin Islands. I would say it is not germane as a consequence.
Does the gentleman wish to be heard on the point of order?
I do, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman is recognized.
I don't know how you can say this is not germane when in reality we're taking language specifically iterated in the bill, we're getting rid of it, we're excising it. And we're leaving part of the language from the bill in the bill. I think it is kind of quite frankly, with all due respect, it's kind of an outrageous argument to make that, you know what, if you've got language in the bill that you're taking out and you're leaving other language in, somehow that this amendment is not germane. I can't believe that the parliamentarian of this body would say that is not germane. And it's an outrageous claim, in my opinion. And so, Mr. Chairman, I know how these things go when you're in the minority, but I don't know how much more germane you could be than say, we're going to excise this language you guys have in there, and we're going to leave other language that you have in there.
Does the gentleman yield back? The chair is prepared to rule on the point of order. Clause 7 of House Rule 16 prohibits amendments that are on a subject matter different than the proposal that is under consideration. The subject of the bill we're currently considering is adding the Virgin Islands to the special visa waiver program for Guam and the Northern Mariana Islands. The gentleman's amendment proposes to amend the visa waiver program with respect to Guam and the Northern Mariana Islands. It also amends a statute that is not amended by the bill, which is a subject different from what we are considering in this bill. The amendment, therefore, is not germane and violates Clause 7 of Rule 16.
I'd appeal the ruling of the chair.
The
Move to table.
Motion to table is not debatable. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Nadler.
Aye.
Mr. Nadler votes aye. Ms. Lofgren.
Yes.
Ms. Lofgren votes yes. Ms. Jackson-Lee. Mr. Cohen. Mr. Johnson of Georgia. Mr. Johnson of Georgia.
Mr. Johnson of Georgia. Put on you're muted. Mr. Johnson, you're muted.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Vote no. Johnson votes no.
The chair voted aye.
The chair voted aye.
But your vote is correct.
So you vote. So, Mr. Johnson, how do you vote?
I think you voted.
Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes no. Mr. Deutsch.
Yeah.
Ms. Bass. Ms. Bass.
Bass votes aye.
Ms. Bass votes aye. Mr. Jeffries?
Aye.
Mr. Jeffries votes aye. Mr. Cicilline?
Aye.
Mr. Cicilline votes aye. Mr. Swalwell?
Swalwell votes aye.
Mr. Swalwell votes aye. Mr. Liu? Mr. Raskin?
Raskin votes aye.
Mr. Raskin votes aye. Ms. Jayapal?
Jayapal votes aye.
Ms. Jayapal votes aye. Ms. Stimmings?
Aye.
Ms. Stimmings votes aye. Mr. Correa?
Correa votes aye.
Mr. Correa votes aye. Ms. Scanlon?
Scanlon votes aye.
Ms. Scanlon votes aye. Ms. Garcia?
Aye.
Ms. Garcia votes aye. Mr. Neguse?
Aye.
Mr. Neguse votes aye. Ms. McBath? Mr. Stanton?
Aye.
Mr. Stanton votes aye. Ms. Dean?
Aye.
Ms. Dean votes aye. Ms. Escobar?
Aye.
Ms. Escobar votes aye. Mr. Jones?
Aye.
Mr. Jones votes aye. Ms. Ross?
Ross votes aye.
Ms. Ross votes aye. Ms. Bush?
Bush votes aye.
Ms. Bush votes aye. Mr. Jordan? Mr. Jordan votes no. Mr. Shabbat?
No.
Mr. Shabbat votes no. Mr. Gomert? Mr. Isa? No. Mr. Isa votes no. Mr. Buck? Mr. Buck votes no. Mr. Gates? Mr. Johnson, Louisiana? Mr. Biggs? Mr. Biggs votes no. Mr. McClintock? Mr. McClintock votes no. Mr. Stubbe? Mr. Tiffany?
No.
Mr. Tiffany votes no. Mr. Massey? Mr. Roy? Mr. Roy votes no. Mr. Bishop? Mr. Bishop votes no. Ms. Fishbach?
No.
Ms. Fishbach votes no. Ms. Sparts? Mr. Fitzgerald? Mr. Fitzgerald votes no. Mr. Benz? Mr. Benz votes no. Mr. Owens?
Mr. Chairman, how am I recorded? Hank Johnson?
Mr. Johnson of Georgia, you are recorded as no.
I changed my vote to yay.
Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes aye.
Congressman Jack recorded.
Ms. Jackson Lee, you are not recorded.
I vote aye.
Ms. Jackson Lee votes aye. Mr. Johnson of Louisiana, you are not recorded. Mr. Johnson of Louisiana votes no.
Has everyone who wishes to be recorded, has everyone
How am
who
I
wishes
recorded,
to...
Mr. Chair?
Mr. Liu, you are not recorded.
How did the chair vote?
Chair voted aye.
I vote aye.
Mr. Liu votes aye.
Has everyone voted who wishes to vote? Clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, there are 22 ayes and 13 noes.
The motion is tabled. Are there any other amendments to the amendment nature of a substitute? For what purposes does Mr. Roy seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report the amendment.
I reserve a point of order.
Point of order is reserved.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 54.
Without objection, further reading, the amendment will be, the amendment will be considered as read. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. We have had a lot of conversations today about our concerns on this side of the aisle about the enforcement of immigration law, border security, and our concerns about the current administration's lack of willingness to enforce the laws of the United States and secure the border. This extends to the, extension of visa waivers, which obviously makes it easier for people to enter the territories of the United States. And in this case, we have little faith, actually zero faith, in the ability of the current secretary to carry out the laws that we're passing, as evidenced by his failure to faithfully execute the laws of the United States pretty much in totality, particularly, for example, the Secure Fence Act and leaving fence parts to rust in fields in Texas and now paying contractors not to build the fence and to fully faithfully execute the laws on the books to require that with the law be enforced and it's already appropriated. He's caused Border Patrol to become dangerously overwhelmed and unable to execute its statutory duties by allowing the policies to overwhelm Border Patrol with 2 million people crossing the border and allowing them to end up having to process people rather than enforcing the border, and allowing 500,000 people to come into the United States who were known gotaways. Now we see what's happening with Title 42. We even have Democrats on the record in the United States Senate, and we have Senator Kyrsten Sinema, we have Senator Mark Kelly, we have Senator Joe Manchin, we have Senator, some fourth senator, Democratic senator, that is not in disagreement with our goal to ensure that Title 42 is enforced. And that's, we're sitting here watching the secretary fail and now requiring, not requiring Title 42 to be enforced. We're going to have an explosion at our border. Again, the secretary hasn't made one public pronouncement, questioning the CDC's decision to not have Title 42 to continue to be enforced, despite actually some members of this own body today saying, oh my gosh, we're going to have some more Omicron in April. Oh, well, let's stop enforcing Title 42. The secretary has allowed migrants to get endangered in violation of federal law. We've got body trailers in counties in South Texas. We've had 600 migrants found dead. We've had thousands that have had to get recovered in the river. We've talked about the agents getting overwhelmed. We're releasing migrants into the United States in violation of federal law. We're having them flown throughout the United States. We've got a refusal purposely to enforce interior immigration laws. ICE is not able to do its job. We've had a minimal number of arrests, something like 20,000 arrests last year compared to something like 250,000 arrests at the height of Trump administration's enforcement of the laws. He's lied to the American people in saying that the southern border was closed. He refuses to apologize for allowing two of the people that work for him in the Department of Homeland Security to say that they were whipping Haitian individuals sitting in the Rio Grande River, literally refusing to this moment to apologize for that, when we know by video evidence and photographic evidence that it was simply not true. He is recklessly and willfully blind to empowering criminal drug cartels who have massive amount of dollars, making hundreds of millions of dollars a day, moving narcotics and dangerous fentanyl into the United States. He has endangered the people of the United States, allowing children in schools, young people, people of all ages, to die because they take Xanax that's laced with fentanyl. He has further damaged United States economic health and wasting the hard-earned money of taxpayers and carrying out his duties. He's allowed illegal immigrants to destroy private property throughout the country, but particularly in South Texas, and ranches and fences. He's placed American citizens in imminent risk of physical harm, and countless other reasons that I'm not even outlining right here. And for those reasons, I have zero confidence in the execution of the laws of the United States by the Secretary of Homeland Security. So here we are, we're about to expand a visa waiver program, and I would just say that if we're going to do this, I would prefer that we not do it until the current secretary is no longer the secretary, and I will yield to my friend from Wisconsin.
Yeah, I would just say to the gentleman from Texas, I don't know if you included ignored court orders in there. And if there's anything that this committee should be concerned about, the Committee on the Judiciary, that court orders are being ignored.
Gentlemen, reclaiming my time, you're right. I skipped that part of this great memorandum that I have. That migrant protection protocols under court order from a federal judge in Texas. We've gotten lip service from the secretary. He's actually distributed memos saying, yeah, we're going to get rid of that, but we're going to pretend to go with the court until we can get past the court order. With that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Does the gentlelady insist on her point of order?
I do not, because this amends the effective date of the act. It is germane. However, I do oppose the amendment, so.
Gentlelady is recognized.
I don't want to get into an extended debate, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Roy has strong opinions. We could go on at great length at this hour about that, but I think Mr. Mayorkas will be before this committee in a few weeks. I'm sure that will be a spirited exchange, so I think we can postpone those discussions till that time, and I do oppose holding the Virgin Islands tourism industry hostage to the tenure of Mr. Mayorkas. And I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. Is there any further discussion of this amendment? In that case, the amendment, the question occurs on the amendment. All in favor say aye. Opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
As for recorded vote, Mr. Chairman.
Recorded vote is requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Nadler.
No.
Mr. Nadler votes no. Ms. Lofgren.
No.
Ms. Lofgren votes no. Ms. Jackson Lee.
No.
Ms. Jackson Lee votes no. Mr. Cohen. Mr. Johnson of Georgia.
Johnson of Georgia votes no.
Mr. Johnson, you'll have to turn your, Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes no. Mr. Deutsch. Ms. Bass. Ms. Bass votes no. Mr. Jeffries.
Jeffries votes no.
Mr. Jeffries votes no. Mr. Cicilline.
No.
Mr. Cicilline votes no. Mr. Swalwell. Mr. Liu. Mr. Raskin. Ms. Jayapal. Ms. Dimmings.
No.
Ms. Dimmings votes no. Mr. Correa.
Correa votes no.
Mr. Correa votes no. Ms. Scanlon. Ms. Garcia. Mr. Neguse.
No.
Mr. Neguse votes no. Ms. McBath. Mr. Stanton.
No.
Ms. Scanlon is not recorded.
Thank you, I appreciate it. Scanlon votes no.
Ms. Scanlon votes no. Mr. Stanton.
I'll talk to you, man. I'll see you.
Mr. Stanton.
No.
Mr. Stanton votes no. Ms. Dean.
Dean votes no.
Ms. Dean votes no. Ms. Escobar.
No.
Ms. Escobar votes no. Mr. Jones. Ms. Ross.
Ross votes no.
Ms. Ross votes no. Ms. Bush.
Bush votes no.
Ms. Bush votes no. Mr. Jordan. Mr. Jordan votes yes. Mr. Shabbat.
Aye.
Mr. Shabbat votes aye. Mr. Gomert. Mr. Issa. Mr. Issa votes yes. Mr. Buck. Mr. Buck votes aye. Mr. Gates. Mr. Johnson of Louisiana. Mr. Johnson of Louisiana votes aye. Mr. Biggs. Mr. McClintock. Mr. McClintock votes aye. Mr. Stube. Mr. Tiffany.
Aye.
Mr. Tiffany votes aye. Mr. Massey. Mr. Roy. Mr. Roy votes aye. Mr. Bishop. Mr. Bishop votes aye. Ms. Fishbach.
Yes.
Ms. Fishbach votes yes. Ms. Sparts. Mr. Fitzgerald. Mr. Fitzgerald votes aye. Mr. Benz? Mr. Benz votes yes. Mr. Owens?
Ms. Jackson Lee?
How am I recorded?
Ms. Jackson Lee is recorded as no.
Mr. Raskin?
How did the chairman vote?
Chairman voted no.
All right, thank you.
Mr. Raskin?
Swalwell?
Mr. Swalwell?
Raskin votes no.
Mr. Raskin votes no. Mr. Swalwell, you are not recorded.
Swalwell's no.
Mr. Swalwell votes no.
Mr. Chairman, how am I recorded? Mr. Chairman,
Garcia?
how am I recorded?
Ms. Garcia, you are recorded. You are not recorded.
I vote no.
Mr. Garcia votes no.
Jayapal votes no also.
Ms. Jayapal votes no.
Thank you.
Are there
Jones
any,
votes no.
Mr. Jones votes no.
are there any members who wish to be recorded who haven't been recorded? Clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, there are 12 ayes and 21 noes.
The amendment is not agreed to. Are there any further amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? For what purpose does Mr. Johnson seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Reserve a point of
Gentleman
order.
Oh, point of, the clerk will report the amendment. A point of order is reserved.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5460, offered by Mr. Johnson of Louisiana.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read, and the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am confident that we're going to get bipartisan support on this one because I just don't know how in the world anybody could refuse it. This amendment creates a list of 6 countries that cannot be added to the visa waiver program for Guam, the Northern Mariana Islands, and the U.S. Virgin Islands. These countries include, everybody listen, Russia, Belarus, China, Iran, North Korea, and Venezuela. Let's go over some facts here real quick. In just over 1 month, Russia killed a confirmed 1,232 Ukrainian civilians. 112 of them were children, at least. The actual number of casualties is actually much higher, but it's difficult to corroborate. On the second day of the Russian invasion, a cluster bomb hit the school of 7-year-old Elisa Halans. Her grandfather was there and tried to shield her from the bomb, but that was tragically not enough, as both he and Elisa were killed by the Russian bomb. Pictures internationally shared after the attack show bodies strewn about and around the entrance of the building. We can only suspect many of the bodies are of children. Due to the grave injustice the Ukrainian people have faced at the hands of Vladimir Putin and his Russian forces, Russia and its allies should not benefit from this visa waiver program or any program the United States offers. On March 2nd, the United Nations General Assembly voted overwhelmingly to demand that Russia withdraw its military forces from Ukraine. Russia, Belarus, and North Korea voted against the resolution. China and Iran strategically abstained from the vote. Belarus directly helped facilitate Russia's war by serving as the staging ground for Russian troops that eventually made their way into the Ukrainian capital. The Iranian president was one of the first world leaders to pledge allegiance to Vladimir Putin's cause, and its supreme leader, the Ayatollah Khamenei, blames the U.S. for the invasion. Since the beginning of the invasion, North Korea has further cozied up to Russia and even put out a statement in which it blames the situation in the Ukraine on the policy of the U.S. and the West. It also used the distraction to test intercontinental ballistic missiles. Illegitimate Venezuela leader Nicolas Maduro, in a phone call with President Putin, gave the dictator his strong support for the Ukrainian invasion. The invasion of Ukraine caused already high oil prices to further skyrocket. Venezuela accounts for the greatest share of global oil reserves, and therefore it stands to make a lot of money from the continuation of the war in Ukraine. Listen, there's a lot of partisan debates and stuff going on here, but these are objective facts. These nations are enemies of the U.S., and we need to make absolutely sure that they cannot be added to this visa waiver program. So I am sure that we'll have unanimous support for this amendment. I urge my colleagues to do so. I yield back.
Does the gentlelady insist on her point of order?
I do, Mr. Chairman. Like several other of the amendments offered, this broadly covers not only the Virgin Islands, which is the subject of the bill, but also Guam and the Northern Mariana Islands. So it is not germane to the bill before us. I would note, however, because obviously what Mr. Johnson has said is the Russian Federation, Belarus, which is acting as their surrogate. I mean, what is happening in Europe today, the absolute butchery of the Russians to the Ukrainian people is completely unacceptable, and it's why these companies will never be part of the visa waiver program, since their inclusion would threaten the security of the United States, and that is a prohibiting factor. But the amendment is not germane.
Does the gentleman wish to be heard on the point of order?
I do, Mr. Chairman. I mean, it's as if germaneness is the big thing that we hide behind now. I mean, you can just cite that for every amendment. Why don't we just all go home? Just go ahead and proclaim that all the amendments are not germane, even though we're pulling language from your bill, as Mr. Biggs's did. And this is, if we all agree that Russia is guilty of all these atrocities, and all of these nations, obviously, half of them want to destroy us, why not just add this to the bill? Why hide behind germaneness? It's an absurd argument. It makes no sense. We could put this in here, safeguard the country. We have an obligation to do it. And I want to know why the Democrat Party is trying to protect Russia. If anybody's watching this at home,
I ask
this is
that the
what's
gentleman consider taking his words back.
Absolutely not. That's not
That is
words that
an
need to be taken
insult
down.
and not true. It's really outrageous.
If you cared as deeply as you say you do, Ms. Lofgren, then you would go along with this
I ask that the
amendment.
gentleman's words be taken down.
I'm not impugning.
Would the gentleman rephrase his words?
Let me say it this way. If all of us do agree with the atrocities that Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, and Venezuela have perpetuated on innocent people, why in the world, even if you thought this was not germane, why would you not take a risk to add this into the statute to make sure that they could never be included in the visa waiver program? Why not take that measure? I do not understand my colleagues on the other side of the aisle.
If I may, Mr. Chairman, on the germaneness rule, we're legislators here, and we follow certain legislative procedures and rules. When you're in the majority, you insist on those structures, and we do the same. I do greatly resent, and I know you know what you said is not correct, that anyone, whichever party they're in, would be defending the animalistic brutality of the Russians in Ukraine. You know that's not the case.
I have great respect.
The chair is prepared to rule on the point of order, and despite what Mr. Johnson says, he should know that several amendments were ruled in order today. But on this amendment is not in order. Clause 7 of House Rule 16 prohibits amendments that are on a subject matter different than the proposal that is under consideration. The subject of the bill we're currently considering is adding the Virgin Islands to the special visa waiver program for Guam and the Northern Mariana Islands. The gentleman's amendment proposes to amend the visa waiver program with respect to Guam and the Northern Mariana Islands, which is a subject different from what we are considering in this bill. The amendment, therefore, is not germane and violates Clause 7 of Rule 16. The amendment is not in order. Are there any further amendments in the nature of to the amendment in the nature of a substitute?
I have an amendment at the desk, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
The gentleman has an amendment at the desk. The clerk will report the amendment.
I reserve a point of order.
Point of order is reserved.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5460, offered by Mr. Bishop of North Carolina. Page 8, after line 4, insert the following. Effective date.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read, and the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The amendment provides that the bill will not take effect if the order to revoke Title 42 protections is in effect on the otherwise effective date of the Act. Very straightforward. The change that will happen with the Title 42 provisions going away, as has been ordered, will be yet another straw on an already broken camel's back, and creating further havoc and disruption and cataclysm in the immigration system of the United States that certainly ought to make us take pause before we introduce new liberalization anywhere in that system. It is almost incomprehensible that we have masks on planes. The chairman said earlier today it was a great idea for people to be fired from their jobs or denied health care, I believe was part of it, if they've refused to take a vaccine, people who are in the United States. The Democrats have supported seeing members of our military service drummed out of the force, drummed out of the service for refusing to take vaccines. We see impositions on Americans every day, and members of the committee have said today that they anticipate another wave is coming, another variant is coming. And yet, the Title 42 protections have been, at least pending the effective date of that order, have been withdrawn from the American people. So this amendment, as I say, is quite simple and quite reasonable, and with that, I yield back.
Does the gentlelady insist on a point of order?
I do, Mr. Chairman. Whereas this actually does amend the effective date, but then it purports to legislate in areas outside the jurisdiction of the Judiciary Committee. These matters are within the jurisdiction of the Energy and Commerce Committee, not the jurisdiction of the Judiciary Committee, and therefore it is not germane.
Does the gentleman wish to be heard?
I do, Mr. Chairman. To the contrary, it says nothing about the amendment doesn't propose to legislate in that area whatsoever. It simply describes a condition that, if it is in place, will prevent the act from taking effect. It simply describes, it's an event that will happen or not. It is not an action by this committee.
The chair is prepared to rule on the point of order. The point of order is well taken in that the rules of the House provide for various committee jurisdictions. The amendment deals with the Department of Health and Human Services, which is within the jurisdiction of the Committee on Energy and Commerce, not within the jurisdiction of the Judiciary Committee, and therefore the amendment is not in order. Are there any further amendments?
I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
I reserve a point of order.
Point of order is reserved.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5460, offered by Mr. Bishop of North Carolina. Page 8, after line 4, insert the following. Effective date. This act and the amendments made by this act shall not take effect unless there are policies in place to suspend the right to introduce.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read, and the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This also is quite straightforward, similar to the prior one, but phrased differently to avoid the point of order. It does not legislate with respect to the Title 42 powers in any way, doesn't mention them. It simply says that the act does not take effect unless there are policies in place to suspend the right to introduce certain persons from countries where a quarantinable, communicable disease exists. So that even more clearly simply states a condition of fact, and again, the purpose is that the United States is likely soon to be without such protection, and until the risk presented by the continuing COVID pandemic or the consequences of the prior pandemic, if it has ended as a technical matter, have been completely dealt with, this new liberalization of immigration law will be suspended from taking effect. I yield back.
Does the gentlelady insist on a point of order?
I do not, Mr. Chairman. I think this is germane. However, I would like to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
I oppose this amendment. We have a whole section in the Immigration and Nationality Act dealing with health-related grounds of inadmissibility, I would draw attention to Section 212A1, health-related grounds. And I just think it's redundant, unnecessary. And I've just got to observe that we've got sort of a duality of argument that we've heard, that the masks and the vaccinations are unnecessary, and that there's an overreaction, and it's big brotherism to take steps to fight COVID. At the same time, we're saying that no one who comes from a country where there's COVID should be admitted into the United States. So I don't think those two are consonant, but I'll just say I don't think this is a necessary amendment, and I therefore oppose it and yield back, Mr. Chairman.
For what purposes does Mr. Jordan seek recognition?
To strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
The previous speaker just said to use the term duality. Well, the contradiction is on their side. On one hand, they're asking, but this was mentioned earlier by the gentleman from Texas. On one hand, they're asking for billions of dollars. The Senate's working on. I read it in Punch Bowl today. It's got to be true, right? The Democrats and the Republicans, they're working on $10 billion COVID relief bill in the Senate. And on the other hand, we got to get rid of Title 42 because there's no such thing as COVID. So there's the contradiction. Holy, it's billions of taxpayer dollars, even though there's $300 billion of COVID money out there somewhere that hasn't been spent, even though there's $225 billion that has been lost or stolen. Not Republicans saying that, NBC News said that. The gentleman's amendment is the least we can do. 1.7 million illegal alien encounters on the border in 14 months. 8,000 a day as we speak. Last year, March was the highest month on record for illegal crossings in our country's history until the next month, April, when it surpassed March. And then April was the highest month on record until May. And then May was the highest month on record until June. And June was the highest month on record until July. Kept going up every single month. And it would be even worse than all that if we didn't have Title 42 in place. So typical of the Biden administration and of Democrats, they're going to say, you know what, the one thing that's helping keep a chaotic situation from getting even more ridiculous is Title 42, so we're going to take it away. But while we take it away, we're going to ask for $10 billion of American tax money for COVID. That is how absurd and crazy this administration is. And guess what? Guess what? It ain't just Republicans saying this is crazy. Not just Republicans, not President Trump. No, no, no. It's Democrat senators, and even two of them from the same state on the border. Senator Sinema and Senator Kelly have both said, don't do this. And the gentleman's amendment simply says, I want to do what the Democrat senators from Arizona want us to do. That's all his amendment says, and the Democrats are saying, we're being inconsistent. What? Craziest argument I've ever heard. So this amendment is as good as it gets. Let's put this in place and give the border agents a chance. They tell us if Title 42 goes away, they say it's going to go from 8,000 a day illegal immigrants crossing our southern border to 18,000. We'll go from 1.7 to 3 million. I mean, if that, I'm almost to the point when I've said this. I think this is deliberate. It has to be intentional. No, because it can't be rational. So this is the least we could do, is take the gentleman's amendment. Be happy to yield time to
I'll take the gentleman's time.
from North Carolina.
I thank the gentleman. I think I remember it being said numbers of times today by the majority that the purpose of this is to promote tourism in the Virgin Islands. So is it not even, I mean, we've shut down everything in America, everything in mainland America for 2 years. Certainly events and things like tourism, we can't even have the American people come freely into the buildings here in D.C. They don't even get to come in their own capital. They're still under restrictions, but there can't be any restriction for people who want to come as tourists to the Virgin Islands that you're going to give a special privilege to? Is there any degree to which you might favor the American people over the people who want to come to America?
Great point.
Is there any circumstance where that might hold true? And how could it possibly be that the Title 42 protections would be withdrawn from the American people when, in fact, if you go back to the very beginning of this, what was well recognized all along was President Trump's decision to stop people traveling into the United States. That was the one key that seems, by everybody's agreement, to have worked. Everything else that's been attempted, at one point in time, Anthony Fauci said masks don't work. Then, of course, masks were necessary, then double masks or triple masks. And all the data suggests it didn't make much difference. But that one step that President Trump took from the very beginning, and even Democrats had to acknowledge it was true. But that protection, which subsequently became embodied in Title 42, no intention to keep it at all.
Time of the gentleman has expired. Does anyone else seek recognition? For what purpose does Mr. Fitzgerald seek recognition? Gentleman is recognized.
I'd ask unanimous consent to enter into the record an article from ABC News from March 29th.
Without objection.
Biden's border crisis has created a backlog of 1.4 million cases in June 2021, which jumped to nearly 1.6 million at the end of December 2021. And now the Democrats want to move the immigration court system back to Article 1 court, which may exasperate the current problems facing the court and make caseload even worse. Despite the persistent and the conditions, which I've viewed with Mr. Biggs down in McAllen, Texas, the administration has chosen to revoke the Title 42, which we've been talking about. I think what this article demonstrated was that now there's estimates as a result of revoking 42, and it could be, this is ABC News, 18,000 migrants per day is what they're anticipating now. That's mind-boggling. I'll just say, in the summer of 2021, nearly half of the 1,000 immigrants who were released from the Border Patrol custody under a notice to report failed to appear as their scheduled court date, which is what a lot of the border agents were telling us when we were down there, and I know there's other members that have been down there numerous times and heard the same story. And the one thing that I remember that they kept bringing up was, please don't revoke Title 42. So I would just say, I think that it sounds like there's kind of an erosion of support even amongst some Democrat lawmakers at this point. And the other thing that's driving me nuts, and it's very obvious to, I think, many members of the public, is that certainly there is this consistency that's been lacking, not only on enforcement, and there may have been so much damage done to public health officials that if we ever have to experience anything close to what we saw before, I'm very concerned that many of those officials will simply be written off and laughed off. But the latest message, and I'm on education and labor too, and this comes up all the time, the student loan stuff. The Biden administration declared the pandemic is over, so pull 42, but at the same time, we continue to push the pause on student loans further and further out. So you can't have it both ways. You either have to have one consistent message on this, and certainly that is not part of what the Biden administration has been messaging as of late. So I yield back. Would the
Gentleman yields back. Who else seeks recognition? In that case,
I've been trying to get on the list.
Ms. Jackson Lee, for what purpose does Ms. Jackson Lee seek recognition?
Strike the last word, Mr.
Gentlelady
Chairman.
is recognized.
Well, I associate myself with the gentlelady from California who's indicated that such provisions that have been offered by this amendment are already included. But I also want to turn the coin, if I will, on my dear friend from Ohio, the ranking member. I find your arguments also similarly confusing if you suggest ours is. You're the party that believes that COVID didn't exist, didn't need vaccines, didn't need masks.
It's not true.
Well, my friend, let me just finish my point. We're encouraging individuals to who worked in hospitals not to get vaccinated, standing on that side. And of course, here you are now trying to be the sort of the lighthouse for COVID. Unfortunately, we're trying to do a COVID bill in the Senate. And our friends on the other side of the aisle are refusing to provide the funding, don't want to provide for vaccination of individuals overseas. But let me just say, as relates to this visa bill for the Virgin Islands, it contains in its four corners protections in terms of
Would the gentlelady yield for a moment?
I'd be happy to yield to.
I would simply point out that the bill the Senate Republicans are holding up provides funding not only for vaccinations overseas, but for continued vaccinations here at home.
Absolutely. I'm very glad the chairman has made that clarification. I didn't want to ignore that. And would be willing, if people were eligible for asylum to coming across the border, they would also have access as well. So that is to safeguard the American people. But I want to just emphasize this horror of using people's plight and the Ukrainian story that was told just a few minutes ago by another member. There are hundreds of Ukrainians at the at the Mexico border. So we're, trying to make a horror story out of what is a potential, rather than assisting the government to do this right, to petition, have people who are eligible to be in the United States for asylum and others processed in a different manner. If you are concerned about Ukrainian refugees, just know that they're going to find any number of ways to come into the United States, and they are right there at the southern border. So let's be consistent in our commitment over the pain, viciousness, and horrors of Vladimir Putin and trying to save those Ukrainians who are getting out of the country. Let's be consistent with our policies. And so what we are doing with this legislation is completely separate. I think we need to pass this bill, pass it quickly. And I look to the Republicans to offer a comprehensive immigration bill. Put it on the table so we can debate it and see if it works. I've not seen one in 2 decades from Republicans, frankly, a comprehensive bill. And you rejected George W. Bush and when he wanted to go forward with the Gang of Eight. So I ask Mr. Chairman if we can proceed to pass this legislation as it is and let our friends on the other side of the aisle develop a comprehensive immigration legislation. My final point is the governor of Texas has chosen to violate federal law and to suggest that he's going to hold hostage those who are coming across the southern border, put them on buses against their will, by the way. That's being held hostage. He doesn't have any federal immigration authority, and ship them to Washington, D.C. All of this stunt behavior is just unacceptable. We need to pass the underlying legislation dealing with visas in the Virgin Islands. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Does anyone else seek recognition?
Mr.
For
Chairman,
what purpose does Mr. Buck seek recognition?
strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Here I was sitting calmly, coolly, collected, not worried about a thing until the gentlelady from Texas spoke. And like a shot of a case of Red Bull, Mr. Chairman, I can't withhold my feelings at this point.
The gentlelady sometimes does have that effect on Mr. Buck.
Yes, she does. I just want to make
You look good you look good, Mr. Buck. I'm glad you're awake now.
I am awake. I'm awake and ready to do battle. I have to tell you, Republicans have consistently stood against vaccine mandates. Republicans have not stood ever, to my knowledge, certainly not this Republican or other Republicans on this committee that I'm aware of, have ever tried to convince people not to take a vaccine if they desired to take a vaccine. That is an important distinction that the public should not be confused about. And this amendment that Mr. Bishop offers is just so, it is common sense that we don't want people to come into this country that have a communicable disease that could spread in this country.
One of the great things that President Trump did during his administration in dealing with this COVID crisis was to stop the travel of individuals from China into the U.S. He did it early, he did it consistently, and it helped thwart the spread of the disease in this country. Mr. Bishop's amendment, much in the same way that past Republican policies have been effective, would help this country deal with any future communicable diseases. It is a straightforward, common sense amendment that I'm surprised at this late hour we can't just agree to and move on with this bill. And with that, I yield to my friend from Ohio, Mr. Jordan.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Of course, COVID is serious, and we have certainly treated it that way. We've all said that just as my friend from Colorado said, we were, vaccines, great, vaccine mandates, we were opposed to that. COVID is serious, but so is the First Amendment. So is the Constitution. I think I may have said this yesterday. The Attorney General, April of 2020, sent a memo to all U.S. attorneys. He said the Constitution is not suspended during a crisis. And amen to that. I would argue that's when it's the most important. And the committee that's supposed to be most concerned about violations of the First Amendment and the Constitution is this committee. But every single right we enjoy as Americans has been assaulted by governments over the last year and a half. Every single one. Up until a few months ago, there were still places in this country where a full congregation could not go to church on Sunday morning. As the gentleman just said from North Carolina, our constituents still are restricted access to their capital that they pay for when they want to come in and petition their member of Congress to redress their grievances. We have to have someone escort them in. It takes forever to get in the thing. And until a few months ago, they couldn't even get in at all. And freedom of speech, we talked about this earlier. Oh my goodness, you disagree with the government? Man, we hear disinformation, misinformation all the time from the left. The biggest offender of disinformation, misinformation was the government during the COVID crisis. I think, I don't know when I said this, but we've been in this markup so long, but almost everything they told us about COVID turned out to be false. The list. Joe Biden, remember when Joe Biden said he had a plan? Well, we know that wasn't the case. Joe Biden said he would never impose a mandate, but he did, so much so the Supreme Court had to tell him it was unconstitutional. They told us COVID didn't come from a lab. Sure looks like it did. They told us COVID wasn't gain-of-function research done in that lab. Sure looks like it was. They said our tax money didn't fund it. Yes, it did. They've told us the vaccinated couldn't get it, the vaccinated couldn't transmit it, and as Mr. Massey talked about earlier, they said there was no such thing as natural immunity. There's a whole bunch of misinformation. So that's our concern, and this amendment's not about COVID. This amendment's about protecting the border. That's why every single Border Patrol agent we talk to says they want Title 42 left in place. Mayors all across the border, Democrat mayors in the state of the lady who just spoke in Texas, want it left in place. Democrat senators from border states want it left in place. The sad thing is we now have one of the two major political parties in this country. The only conclusion any rational person can reach is they want a completely open border. They don't want a border. They want what Hillary Clinton said. They want a borderless hemisphere. And that's just unbelievable that one of the political parties, major political parties in our country, has adopted that position. I yield back.
I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman yields back. Is there any further discussion on the amendment? Seeing none, the question occurs on the amendment. All in favor say aye. Opposed, nay. Nay.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
Recorded vote, please.
Recorded vote is requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Nadler.
No.
Mr. Nadler votes no. Ms. Lofgren.
No.
Ms. Lofgren votes no. Ms. Jackson-Lee.
No.
Ms. Jackson-Lee votes no. Mr. Cohen. Mr. Johnson of Georgia.
No.
Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes no. Mr. Deutsch. Ms. Bass.
No.
Ms. Bass votes no. Mr. Jeffries. Mr. Cicilline.
No.
Mr. Cicilline votes no. Mr. Swalwell. Mr. Liu?
No.
Mr. Liu votes no. Mr. Raskin?
Raskin votes no.
Mr. Raskin votes no. Ms. Jayapal?
No.
Ms. Jayapal votes no. Ms. Stimmings?
No.
Ms. Stimmings votes no. Mr. Correa?
Correa votes no.
Mr. Correa votes no. Ms. Scanlon?
Scanlon votes no.
Ms. Scanlon votes no. Ms. Garcia?
No.
Ms. Garcia votes no. Mr. Neguse?
No.
Mr. Neguse votes no. Ms. McBath? Mr. Stanton?
No.
Mr. Stanton votes no. Ms. Dean?
No.
Ms. Dean votes no. Ms. Escobar?
No.
Ms. Escobar votes no. Mr. Jones?
No.
Mr. Jones votes no. Ms. Ross?
Ross votes no.
Ms. Ross votes no. Ms. Bush?
Bush votes no.
Ms. Bush votes no. Mr. Jordan? Mr. Jordan votes yes. Mr. Shabbat?
Aye.
Mr. Shabbat votes aye. Mr. Gomert? Mr. Isa? Mr. Isa votes aye. Mr. Buck? Mr. Buck votes aye. Mr. Gates? Mr. Gates votes aye. Mr. Johnson of Louisiana? Mr. Johnson of Louisiana votes aye. Mr. Biggs?
Aye.
Mr. Biggs votes aye. Mr. McClintock? Mr. McClintock votes aye. Mr. Stube? Mr. Tiffany? Mr. Massey?
Aye.
Mr. Massey votes aye. Mr. Roy? Mr. Bishop?
Aye.
Mr. Bishop votes aye. Ms. Fishbach?
Aye.
Ms. Fishbach votes aye. Ms. Sparts? Mr. Fitzgerald? Mr. Fitzgerald votes aye. Mr. Benz? Mr. Benz votes yes. Mr. Owens?
How is Swallow recorded?
Mr. Swalwell, you are not recorded.
No.
Mr. Swalwell votes no.
Mr. Chairman, how am I recorded?
Mr. Jeffries, you are not recorded.
Jeffries votes no.
Mr. Jeffries votes no.
How's McBath recorded?
Ms. McBath, you are not recorded.
Rep McBath votes no.
Ms. McBath votes no. Mr. Roy votes aye.
Are there any other members who wish to vote who haven't voted? The clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, there are 14 ayes and 23 noes.
The amendment is not agreed to. Are there any further amendments? If not, the question occurs on the amendment nature of a substitute. This will be followed immediately by a vote on final passage of the bill. All those in favor respond by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment nature of a substitute is agreed to. Reporting quorum being present, the question is on the motion to report the bill H.R. 5460 as amended favorably to the House. Those in favor respond by saying aye. Aye. Opposed?
Aye.
Opposed? Opposed, no. The ayes have it, and the bill is ordered reported favorably. Roll call is requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Nadler?
Aye.
Mr. Nadler votes aye. Ms. Lofgren? Ms. Lofgren?
Aye, pardon me.
Ms. Lofgren votes aye. Ms. Jackson-Lee?
Aye.
Ms. Jackson-Lee votes aye. Mr. Cohen? Mr. Johnson of Georgia?
Yes, how did the chair vote?
The chair voted aye.
I vote aye.
Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes aye.
This is final passage.
Mr. Deutsch. Ms. Bass.
Bass votes aye.
Ms. Bass votes aye. Mr. Jeffries.
Jeffries votes aye.
Mr. Jeffries votes aye. Mr. Cicilline.
Aye.
Mr. Cicilline votes aye. Mr. Swalwell.
Aye.
Mr. Swalwell votes aye. Mr. Liu.
Aye.
Mr. Liu votes aye. Mr. Raskin.
Raskin votes aye.
Mr. Raskin votes aye. Ms. Jayapal.
Jayapal votes aye.
Ms. Jayapal votes aye. Ms. Stimmings.
Aye.
Ms. Stimmings votes aye. Mr. Correa.
Correa votes aye.
Mr. Correa votes aye. Ms. Scanlon.
Aye.
Ms. Scanlon votes aye. Ms. Garcia.
Aye.
Ms. Garcia votes aye. Mr. Neguse.
Aye.
Mr. Neguse votes aye. Ms. McBath.
McBath votes aye.
Ms. McBath votes aye. Mr. Stanton.
Aye.
Mr. Stanton votes aye. Ms. Dean.
Aye.
Ms. Dean votes aye. Ms. Escobar.
Aye.
Ms. Escobar votes aye. Mr. Jones.
Aye.
Mr. Jones votes aye. Ms. Ross.
Ross votes aye.
Ms. Ross votes aye. Ms. Bush.
Bush votes aye.
Ms. Bush votes aye. Mr. Jordan. Mr. Jordan. Mr. Jordan votes no. Mr. Shabbat. Mr. Gomert. Mr. Isa. Mr. Isa votes no. Mr. Buck. Mr. Buck votes no. Mr. Gates. Mr. Gates votes no. Mr. Johnson of Louisiana. Mr. Johnson of Louisiana votes no. Mr. Biggs.
No.
Mr. Biggs votes no. Mr. McClintock. Mr. McClintock votes no. Mr. Stube. Mr. Tiffany.
Tiffany, no.
Mr. Tiffany votes no. Mr. Massey.
Aye.
Mr. Massey votes aye. Mr. Roy. Mr. Roy votes no. Mr. Bishop. Mr. Bishop votes no. Ms. Fishbach.
No.
Ms. Fishbach votes no. Ms. Sparts. Mr. Fitzgerald. Mr. Fitzgerald votes no. Mr. Benz. Mr. Benz votes no. Mr. Owens.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Jordan, you're recorded as no.
Mr. Chairman. Mr.
Mr.
Shabbat here.
Shabbat?
No.
Mr. Shabbat votes no.
Has every member voted who wishes to vote? The clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, there are 24 ayes and 14 noes.
The ayes have it, and the bill is amended as ordered reported favorably to the House. Members will have 2 days to submit views. Without objection, the bill will be reported as a single amendment in nature of a substitute incorporating all adopted amendments, and staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes. Pursuant to notice, I now call up H.R. 3648, the Equal Access to Green Cards for Legal Employment Act of 2021, or the EAGLE Act of 2021, for purposes of markup, and move that the committee report the bill favorably to the House. The clerk will report the bill.
H.R. 3648, to amend the immigration
Without
and...
objection, the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I will begin by recognizing myself for an opening statement. H.R. 3648, the EAGLE Act of 2022, is a bipartisan bill that would make significant improvements to our legal immigration system. Every year, there are 140,000 green cards available to employment-based immigrants and 226,000 green cards available for certain family-sponsored immigrants. However, no more than 7% of the green cards in each category can go to individuals born in any one country. These numerical limits were last updated in 1990 and have not changed since. Today, more than 1 million individuals are stuck in the employment-based immigrant visa backlog, and nearly 4 million are waiting for a family-sponsored immigrant visa. These backlogs grow longer each year and can be devastating, especially for those from high-demand countries who are forced to endure the longest wait times. Because the per-country caps, foreign nationals from some countries must wait decades in the immigrant visa backlog. This forces families to endure long periods of separation from their loved ones. In some instances, the backlog is so long that the promise of a green card is practically illusory. For example, certain family-sponsored immigrants from the Philippines must wait nearly 78 years before they are eligible to receive a green card. Employment-based immigrants from countries such as India are also forced to wait decades before they are eligible to receive a green card, and in some cases, the path is essentially closed. The Congressional Research Service estimates that an Indian national whose EB-2 immigrant petition was approved in 2021 will have to wait more than 189 years to receive a green card. Even though most employment-based immigrants live and work in the U.S. while waiting for a green card, they still experience significant hardships. These prospective immigrants cannot switch jobs unless a new employer agrees to file a petition on their behalf. This limited mobility can subject immigrant workers to exploitative work conditions and allow unscrupulous employers to take advantage of them, often at the expense of U.S. workers. Additionally, the children of employment-based immigrants who turn 21 before they reach the front of the line age out of dependent status and often become ineligible for a green card. Some are even forced to leave their families and depart the United States because they cannot rely on their parents' immigration status. Our immigration laws should treat everyone equally and should not discriminate based on a foreign national's country of birth. This outdated framework has kept families apart for decades and prevented U.S. employers from accessing and retaining the employees they need to stay competitive. It is essential that we alleviate the hardships for those who are suffering most under the decades-long immigrant visa backlogs. The EAGLE Act would improve the green card process by raising the per-country caps excuse me, on family-sponsored immigrant visas from 7% to 15%, and by eliminating the per-country caps on employment-based immigrant visas. The bill would also temporarily provide protections, including work and travel authorization, for certain individuals stuck in the employment-based immigrant backlog. In addition, it would implement reforms to the H-1B non-immigrant visa program to protect U.S. workers and prevent other abuses of the program. I would like to thank Zoe Lofgren, the chair of the Immigration and Citizenship Subcommittee, for her leadership and commitment to this issue. I appreciate all the work she put in with our colleagues on both sides of the aisle to develop the EAGLE Act of 2022, and I urge all my colleagues to support this important bipartisan legislation. I now recognize the ranking member of the Judiciary Committee, the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Jordan, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Republicans have supported legislation in the past to eliminate annual per-country cap on employment-based green card issuance and raise the cap on family-based green card issuance to 15%. At the time, many of us agreed with the concept that green cards should be issued on a first-come, first-served basis. However, with the way President Biden has mismanaged immigration, we now think the issue deserves a much closer review. The bill before us today is vastly different from provisions of previous versions. H.R. 3648 is a version of a patchwork of provisions put together in the Senate last Congress. The legislation is a, quote, version of that bill because it purposely omits provisions insisted upon by Senator Scott. Senator Scott's provisions would prevent aliens with ties to the Chinese military or the Chinese Communist Party from receiving green cards and ensure that the green cards issued each year are not at all used by the hundreds of thousands of H-1B visa holders in the U.S. The Democrats were serious about enacting this legislation. Why would they omit that provision they know is necessary for Senate passage? There are several other additional concerns we have with the legislation. For instance, this version does not include a transition period for the employment-based fifth preference category, the EB-5 category. We've long had concerns with the EB-5 program, given the amount of CCP money used to fund investment projects in the United States and the number of Chinese nationals connected to the Chinese Communist Party who buy their green cards using this program. The vast majority of aliens on the EB-5 waitlist are Chinese nationals, and if this bill is enacted, only Chinese nationals will get the EB-5 green cards for several years. Given the CCP's theft of U.S. intellectual property and the sensitive technologies, I think we're all concerned that this bill will result in adverse consequences to U.S. national security. In addition, HR 3648, as currently drafted, would result in the immediate exclusion from green cards of special immigrant religious workers from around the world. Instead, special immigrant juveniles from the Northern Triangle countries will get green cards because the bill does not contain a transition period for the employment-based fourth preference category. Section 7 of the legislation allows certain non-immigrant visa holders to file an application for adjustment for status despite the fact that no green cards are available to them. The result is an in-run around the overall annual green card limit, and hundreds of thousands of illegal aliens will be able to live and work in the United States as if they had a green card. We should not carve out special green card-like situations for certain aliens, particularly in light of what we just discussed a few minutes ago. 1.7 million illegal crossings in 14 months, 8,000 a day as we speak, and the Biden administration is getting set to remove Title 42, which the Border Patrol people tell us is going to take it to 18,000 crossings a day. These are the concerns that we have as a result of a rush to simply get something, anything, passed in the Senate late last Congress. Given the crisis on our southern border and the disaster that President Biden has created in our immigration system, as well as the changes to this bill in this Congress, I would urge us to vote against this legislation and yield back.
Without objection, all other opening statements will be included in the record. I now recognize myself for purposes of offering an amendment in the nature of a substitute. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to HR 3648, offered by Mr.
Without
Homeland.
objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute will be considered as read and shall be considered as base text for purposes of amendment. I will recognize myself to explain the amendment. This amendment in the nature of a substitute makes a number of technical changes, along with one substantive change that was developed in close coordination with my colleagues in the minority. Recently, it came to our attention that foreign media companies may be using the H-1B visa program to employ reporters and other media personnel in the United States. This is not an appropriate use of the H-1B visa program. As such, we added a provision that bans representatives of foreign media from qualifying for H-1B visas. Under existing law, there is already a specific visa category for representatives of foreign media, the I visa. Representatives of foreign media companies that are coming to the United States to work in that capacity should only be admitted pursuant to an I visa. This amendment changes the underlying legislation to prohibit the use of the H-1B visa program by foreign media companies. With regard to the technical changes, they are all minor and necessary to ensure that the legislation is implemented as intended. For example, we removed the prior references to a specific immigration form number in Section 7 of the underlying legislation. This change was made to ensure that any changes made by the Department of Homeland Security to the numbering of forms does not impact the application of this legislation. I urge all members to support the amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time. Are there any amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute?
Mr. Chairman,
For what purpose does Ms. Lufkin seek recognition?
to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to go a little bit into the history of this effort because it has one. Our former colleague, Mr. Chaffetz, and these are his words, because he said on the radio that he stole my idea for his bill, but because he was a freshman, he didn't know what was against the protocols. So we worked together on this bill, and it received, when he was the author, good support. And this last Congress, a predecessor bill was introduced by myself and Mr. Buck, and when it was considered on the floor, it had 311 co-sponsors and passed on suspension 365 to 65. And 25 current members of this committee voted for the bill, including Mr. Jordan, Mr. Buck, Mr. Shabbat, Mr. Gates, and Mr. Massey. After that, the Senate, as they sometimes do, deliberated on end, and they had suggestions, some of which were good ones. As many of you know, Mr. Grassley and Mr. Durbin have made an effort to make the H-1B program more transparent, and we agreed with that. And in fact, Mr. Issa and I have discussed that he and I are going to work together on a bigger reform of the H-1B program, which is necessary, and I'm looking forward to that. We made an effort in a prior Congress, but I think so many things have changed. It's we might be able to get the bipartisan consensus that we need to reform that system. But that doesn't mean that the transparency measures and the other reform measures suggested by the senators aren't a good idea. We think they are. The transition period was extended from 3 to 9 years, and we did some other things to make sure that people who are currently in line for visas would not be disadvantaged. No one who is currently in line would be impacted adversely by this bill because of the transition period. I think it's necessary to talk about how the immigration system actually works because it's counterintuitive. Let's talk about the employment side. People said they're for legal immigration. Most of the individuals impacted by this bill they're already present in the United States. 98% of them are here lawfully on a temporary visa, and they want to become permanent residents. So in order for that to happen, the employer needs to advertise and prove that there's no one here who will take the job that they're being offered. Further, and I think this is something Mr. Ice and I will be working on and strengthening, but you have to meet salary standards, advertising standards, in order to get approval to get in line. You would think that that's merit-based is really what it is. But once that happens, we have this arbitrary distribution of visas. And because it's by the country of birth. It has nothing to do with the merits of the individual. So for example, Europe has a population of 746,400,000. They have visas under the employment-based program of a little over 22,000. India has a population of 1,380,000,000, and they have less visas than Europe at 18,553. So although what happens is because of the way we've set this system up, people who are equally qualified, and in some cases more qualified, are falling behind people just because of their country of birth. That's not merit-based. That's not the opportunity society that America is. And so we do need to reform this system. I do think that it's important that we do this. I'm grateful to Mr. Curtis and the other co-sponsors, including Republicans, who are trying to get this done. I assume there'll be an amendment on the Scott Amendment, but let me just touch on that because the ranking member mentioned it. There was a provision about communism, and as I mentioned, under the
The time of the gentlelady has expired. Who seeks recognition? Mr. McClintock. For what purpose does Mr. McClintock seek recognition?
Speak on the bill.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Of course, there's a huge difference in when this bill was taken up a few years ago and today. A few years ago, Obama's DHS secretary called 1,000 illegal crossings a bad day. We're at 8,000 now, and the president's promising to take that to up to 18,000 per day when he lifts Title 42. 18,000 per day. We need to be very clear about what that means. The Democrats are preparing to admit the entire population of the state of Wyoming every 32 days. That's what 18,000 is. An unvetted, impoverished population the size of Wyoming, illegally crossing the border and being admitted into the country every 32 days. This is turning every community in America into a border town. It's going to be keenly felt by Americans as public schools, public hospitals, job markets, law enforcement, social services are all utterly overwhelmed by these numbers. The Mexican crime cartels are reportedly making more money in human trafficking than they are in drug trafficking. Just last week, the Department of Homeland Security confirmed to me that there was a marked increase in southwest border apprehensions of aliens listed in the terrorist screening database during the last fiscal year. That's what's unfolding before our eyes as a deliberate policy of the Democratic Party. And now we have this measure to change the per-country caps. The continuing theme we hear is that despite all of these jaw-dropping numbers and despite the impact on American families as the labor market is flooded with low-wage illegal immigrant workers, we need to encourage more of it. Now, at the first immigration subcommittee hearing of this session, the Republican witness documented the tremendous negative impact that illegal immigration is having on African American communities. As Peter Kirsanoff stated, quote, not only do illegal immigrants compete for jobs with African Americans, but that competition drives down wages for the jobs that are available. At our second hearing, we learned how flooding the market with low-wage labor does enormous economic harm to all working Americans. We also heard how many guest worker programs allow employers to fill positions at wages substantially less than the domestic labor market would otherwise command. As I noted then, this is at the expense of working Americans whose wages stagnated for decades as the immigrant share of the population literally tripled. At the subcommittee's third hearing, a Republican witness described the damage done to American workers and to the foreign workers themselves through abuses in guest worker programs like H-1B, L-1, and the practical training program. We heard how, despite assurances of the left, pay far below the market rates for labor is displacing skilled American workers. Yet here we are today, considering this bill that will ensure a flood of foreign workers who came to the U.S. on temporary visas get to stay here and work permanently. This bill would, among other things, eliminate the per-country limits on employment-based immigrant visas and raise it from 7% to 15% for family-sponsored admissions. This undermines the very purpose of our immigration laws that can be summed up in a single word: assimilation. Our immigration laws were written to assure that as immigrants come to America, they come with a sincere desire to become Americans, to raise their children as Americans, to adopt a common language, a common culture, and a common appreciation of American constitutional principles. Assimilation is hard. It requires learning a new language, accepting and adopting new customs and new beliefs. Assimilation breaks down if the concentration of immigrants from any single country reaches a level where assimilation is no longer necessary. That's why these laws are written with the established caps, which this bill would eviscerate. No civilization has survived an illegal mass migration of the magnitude the Democrats have now precipitated upon our country. In the face of this unprecedented crisis, it seems absurd even to discuss a bill like this, and yet here we are. We have 3 more years of this crisis, and it's going to get worse until the people responsible for it are removed from office. Then we're going to need to rewrite our immigration laws to serve their original purpose, assimilation. Now, that's a dirty word to the left, but it's absolutely essential to assure the continuation of what Lincoln rightly called the last best hope of mankind on this earth. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does Ms. Dean seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I ask to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
And I really ask to strike the last word, especially the words about the whole purpose of immigration is assimilation. How about the purpose of immigration is to grow the joy and strength of this country? Strange, very strange words coming from the gentleman on the other side of the aisle. I rise in support of this legislation, the EAGLE Act. Our immigration system is clearly broken. We have to do more as a Congress to make sure that we improve our immigration system, that we repair it, that we meet the needs of people who are in this country and who are wishing to come to this country, like my ancestors many years ago from Ireland. But how will we look to repair it? We must ensure the amazing contributions from immigrant communities can continue. Currently, more than 1 million people who are eligible for employment-based green cards cannot continue their path to citizenship because of immigrant visa availability. Many will have to wait years, decades, before getting their green cards. This is all due to an outdated immigration laws that were enacted before half the people in this room or on this Zoom were even born. I have heard from constituents as recently as this week, multiple times, from countries all around the world begging Congress to take action. That said, I am in support of addressing the backlog and immigrants who are disproportionately impacted by our broken system. That is why I am a co-sponsor of this bill. My current apprehension is tied to the thousands of people from across the world who have been waiting with their lives in limbo. I plan to work closely with this committee to better understand whether removing the caps would shift the backlog from immigrants from one country to immigrants across the world. It is time for a change, but I want to be sure that the positive impacts of the EAGLE Act will not cause undue harm to people who have been waiting in line for years. And that is what this committee is committed to doing. I commend Representative Lofgren for recognizing that per county limitations imposed on employment-based immigrants inhibit the United States from attracting the best and the brightest who look to make our country a better place. I will lift the legislation that can help millions currently left in limbo. Nevertheless, I do hope to be able to reassure all of my constituents before this bill goes to the floor that we will not harm the chances of their American dream. I am pleased that our committee is focused on addressing the harms created during previous administrations. Bills like the Jumpstart and our Legal Immigration System Act will surgically address these issues. With the passage of this bill, nearly 380,000 unused visas would be reclaimed, and individuals would be able to apply for the adjustment of status earlier. I support the EAGLE Act and thank the representative from California, and will yield the balance of my time to the gentlewoman if she so desires, Mr. Chairman. Otherwise, Mr. Chairman, I thank you.
Thank you for yielding just a few minutes. I was going to say in my earlier statements that the Scott Amendment, which came late in last Congress, was poorly crafted. In the Immigration Nationality Act, we bar people, an immigrant or anyone who is trying to enter, who has been a member of or affiliated with the communist or other totalitarian party, but there is an exception for involuntary membership because in some cases with totalitarian countries, they put teenagers into the party. They don't get a say. And so you need to at least understand that. Mr. Scott was really not very open to working through this. He also created a new backlog on the H-2B program, which was completely at odds with what we're trying to do. It's important to remember that in terms of wages, it's by wage salary. You can't pay an H-1B worker or someone who's applied for permanent residence less than the prevailing wage. And I think everybody who would be benefited from this bill is legally present in the United States. We have set up a system where it works except that people will die on the waiting list. And I thank the gentlelady for yielding.
The time of the gentlelady has expired.
Chairman.
For what purpose does Mr. Shabbat seek recognition?
Move strike last word, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in opposition to this legislation. Look, we've got a crisis at our southern border, as we've been saying over and over again all day. There are untold numbers of aliens crossing it every day already. That number is going to become exponentially larger due to the Biden administration's misguided decision to terminate Title 42. Now, Title 42, as we've also said quite a few times today, has resulted in the expulsion of some 1.7 million illegal immigrants from the United States over the last year. Those who aren't expelled are put on buses and planes and disappear into communities all over the country. And as I said earlier, we normally think of Texas and New Mexico and Arizona and California, for example, as border states. But let's face it, we're all border states now because the Biden administration is shipping these
people everywhere. Again, the taxpayers are footing the bill. Now, after the Biden administration kills Title 42, the Department of Homeland Security is expected to encounter upwards of 18,000 immigrants each day. Each day, 18,000 immigrants. Now, if you do the math, in 1 month, that's over 500,000. 12 months in a year, you're looking at 6 million people potentially in a year's time. Now, since I've been in Congress, we've been talking about there being 11 million people here illegally in the country. It never seems to go up. It's always 11 million. If you have 6 million in a year, you're essentially doubling that number that we've been saying has been accumulated in this country for years and years and years. In 2 years, you'd be doubling that number if the statistics that we've been given are accurate. And I think there's no reason to believe that they're not. Tens of thousands are waiting to enter this country illegally. Why? Well, it's because the Biden administration is doing all it can to upend the very effective immigration policies of the previous administration. In essence, it's like we don't even have a southern border at all anymore. And that's because the Biden administration rolled out a big fat welcome mat to any and all who want to enter our country illegally. The Biden administration is essentially incentivizing illegal immigration. They've stopped building the wall. It's out rusting there. They've ended catch and release, and they're about to end Title 42 removals and give aliens free food and shelter and transportation to the location of their choosing. The last thing we ought to be doing right now is removing country caps, which just provide additional green cards to Chinese nationals at a time when the Chinese Communist Party is stealing our intellectual property. They're committing human rights abuses, whether it's the Uyghurs, Hong Kong, the Falun Gong, Tibetan still. Human rights abuses by the Chinese Communist Party continue on and on and on. And they're doing everything in their power to subvert our government. And they're also working behind the scenes and to some degree in the open with Vladimir Putin to undermine and kill Ukrainian citizens every day. And their actions when it comes to purchasing energy or other things are undermining the sanctions that have been imposed on Putin to hopefully end this war and to save as many innocent Ukrainian citizens as possible. So the Chinese are undermining us there, and so we're going to allow more green cards for more Chinese nationals to come into the United States. It makes absolutely no sense. Therefore, I urge my colleagues, I'd like to say on both sides of the aisle, but we know it's a practical matter, that ain't going to happen, to oppose this legislation and urge the majority to pass meaningful legislation which will stop the flow of illegal immigrants and drugs across our southern border into the United States. And as I also said earlier, you know, we're for immigration, legal immigration. We're opposed to illegal immigration, and we're willing to work with the majority on true comprehensive, if you want to call it that, immigration reform. But we have to have control of our border before we do that. And the problem is everything you're doing, along with this administration, is undermining border control. And I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose does Ms. Ross seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to express my full support for this bill, which will greatly improve our employment-based immigration system. I represent the Research Triangle of North Carolina, which owes its success to foreign companies that have moved to North Carolina and to the many hardworking immigrants who have moved to my district and make it stronger and better every day. By removing the per-country caps and reducing the number of children who will age out of legal status in the future, the EAGLE Act will make our immigration system fairer. to the great benefit of our country. The EAGLE Act will help so many residents of my district. My constituent, Srini, has been living and working in the district for over a decade legally and has 2 children, including a daughter who was born in the US and has special needs. Srini was able to provide the best possible care for his daughter until 2018, when his visa was suddenly denied by USCIS and he was forced to leave the US and go back to India within 60 days. He didn't have any other option other than to take his daughter to India with him, where it was incredibly difficult for him to find proper care for her. After a struggle, Srini was eventually able to come back to the US, but he had to restart his journey in becoming a permanent resident. This kind of uncertainty doesn't only affect Srini, but also US citizens like Srini's daughter. Srini also has a son who's not a citizen, but it is on the verge of aging out of the legal immigration system when he turns 21. His son is a documented dreamer, came here legally. For the first time in this Congress, documented dreamers have been included in immigration reform, thanks to the effort of Congresswoman Lofgren with the American Dream and Promise Act. By reducing the monumental backlog at USCIS for individuals from high immigration countries, this bill will provide relief for some documented dreamers who are often forced to self-deport because of decade-long wait times for green cards. These are young people who have been educated in this country and who want to stay here. They want to be American citizens. They want to fill the jobs and they want to live out the American dream. However, these documented dreamers are not eligible for DACA protection. While this legislation will fix one of the root causes of aging out, we must also ensure that we protect those who have previously aged out of the system. We need their smarts, their determination, and their commitment to this country. It's time to permanently fix this problem for all documented dreamers by passing the bipartisan, bicameral American Children's Act. The EAGLE Act constitutes an important step in bringing needed equity to our immigration system. I hope this committee will advance the EAGLE Act and the documented dreamers, along with the great work we've done for the American Dream and Promise Act and all the dreamers. If Chair Lofgren would like a little bit of additional time, I will yield to her. Otherwise, I've completed my statement.
I thank you for yielding the time. I just wanted to mention, in terms of the transition period that has been discussed, no one who is in line today will be displaced or disadvantaged. But it is important to know that people who have advanced degrees and have extraordinary talent, if they're from India, are actually getting visas before people with a bachelor's degree from a Western European country. It's irrational what we've created here, and it's also dysfunctional. If you're in a line that's going to go 100 years, it's really a fraud that we're perpetrating on these businesses and intending immigrants. I thank the gentlelady for yielding.
The time of the gentlelady has expired. For what purpose does Mr. Issa seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
I reserve a point of order.
Point of order is reserved.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 3.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment will be considered as read, and the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As the Chairwoman Lofgren noted, she and I have worked together extensively over the years. with a small change, which is indexed for inflation. This is in fact the addition of the legislation that passed out of this committee unanimously just 3 years ago. I recognize that many could say that we could do a lot more work, but when you have a piece of legislation that has merit, directly talks to exactly what we've been talking about here, some of the challenges that come from not indexing and not modernizing the standards under which people are given consideration to come here, then what you do is you create a front end that may be unfair, and if you fix the back end, and we'll use India as an example, if you bring in people more than you should and they happen to be from some country, then what you've done is you've created a backlog. In many cases, Indian consulting firms and others who used a system did so, quite frankly, to bring in inexpensive labor, sometimes with good degrees, but willing to work cheaper. That can be partially resolved by this fairly narrow piece of legislation, again, that passed unanimously. But when we look at the back end of lifting the per country caps, we certainly should include, at a minimum, this which addresses the front end. It's a modest change. I'm not going to claim that it's grandiose. The gentlelady from California and I called it modest when we offered it. But I think at this time, if this bill, this bipartisan and bicameral bill that the gentlelady has offered, is to be strengthened, why not add something which is germane and which attacks some of the front-end causes? So I would hope that it would be accepted. If there are technical corrections or something, I'd be glad to work with the chairman. But I think in its current form, it's a well-thought-out and historically popular piece of legislation. So I would hope that it would be accepted in the spirit in which it's been offered. And I yield.
Gentleman yields back. Does the gentlelady insist on her point of order?
I do not. This is a germane amendment, but I would like to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
I have a suggestion, Mr. Issa, and that would be, obviously, we want to look for a moving vehicle on H-1B reform, and as you and I discussed briefly, where we left off on our reform is not necessarily where we need to start, because we've learned a lot since we last visited this. One of the suggestions that's been made is that level 1 be eliminated entirely. Another suggestion, this is on the H-1B program, another suggestion that has been made is that we go to an auction system when it comes to wages, so the people who are paying the most, since we're not increasing the number of H-1B visas in this bill or any other. Here's what I would prefer to do if you're game to do this. We're going to have a number of weeks before this, assuming we report this bill out, goes to the floor. Can I suggest that we, in the weeks to come, sort through these suggestions and come up with a package that we can have included when the bill is considered by the Rules Committee, rather than doing a piecemeal measure today?
Would the gentlelady yield?
I would certainly yield.
I'd love nothing more than to work on that. Having been a chairman and over the years made some of these offers and working in this committee, and knowing that this provision, even if it passes here tonight, could be stripped out when it goes to the floor, I would prefer and I would suggest that we use it as base text when it leaves here. We work on it, and that way we're making a comparatively minor, because I think this base text would be relatively easy to further amend for some of these areas that I agree with you
Reclaiming
we
my
could do.
time, I don't want to oppose the gentleman's amendment, but I would have to, because it may be this is too low when it comes to computer scientists in Silicon Valley. It is too low, and it may be too high when it comes to nurses in Iowa. So I think we need to have a little more fine-tuning to this. You and I both know that the wages are problematic, and the outsourcing companies, for lack of a better word, are the most problematic portion of this H-1B. Now, we never defined, we never did an actual prohibition on outsourcing companies, and it's not clear to me that we could not do that. We need to do so cautiously because there are legitimate, for example, accounting companies that are American companies. They send, the accountants out to other companies. That's what they do, they're accountants. So we don't want to tie up legitimate American companies that may have talent from other countries. But I don't want to support this today because I'm not sure it's right, but I don't think you and I are out of sync in terms of what we accomplish. So don't make me oppose your amendment, but if you insist, I will have to.
If the gentlelady would further yield, I would not want you to force you to do anything. I will note for the record that we did take the base text from 2017. We did index it for CPI. The bill that this committee voted unanimously would be exactly with the numbers. In other words, if we had been successful in 2017, this would be exactly where we would pick
But
up.
reclaiming my time, as I said in my opening statement, a lot has changed since we last worked on this, and I don't think we can just start where we left off, because there are real problems in the H-1B program that we need to deal with, that we've learned about. I want to work with you on that, but I don't think this is a good start.
Again, if the gentlelady will yield one last time. Again, I'm not going to disagree with the lady, and I understand the votes we have here tonight. So I will probably lose on this, but I will agree to lose as a voice vote. But what I would like to do is to have all of us recognize that if we do not do this on the floor, by the time it goes to the floor, then the status quo, which is the abuse that you and I fought all the way back in 17, will continue, and that's why I offered it. And actually, out of deference to my colleague, I will withdraw the amendment with the recognition that this really needs to move on a vehicle, or we will allow something to continue that shouldn't.
Reclaiming my time, I agree, and I look forward to some good, solid work in the next few weeks with you.
I think the chairman withdraw.
The amendment is withdrawn. Are there any further, for what purpose does Ms. Jayapal seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm very proud to support this bill, which would make crucial changes to addressing backlogs in the employment and family-based immigration systems. I think I'm sitting here today as one of the very few members of Congress who has actually been on an H-1B visa, came to the United States from India at 16 by myself. Took me 17 years on an alphabet soup of visas until I finally became a US citizen. And although processing times to transition to permanent resident status from an H-1B back then were not nearly as bad as they are now, I was not able to secure my green card through an H-1B. I secured it through marriage to my US citizen husband. And this is a longer story for another time, but that wasn't easy either. It's been 14 years since Representative Lofgren introduced the first iteration of the EAGLE Act. And since then, the green card backlog has just worsened. Today, an estimated 1 million people are waiting for an employment-based green card, and 4 million are waiting for a family-based green card. And an estimated 1.6 million people in the family backlog and 200,000 people in the employment backlog will die before they ever receive green cards. These backlogs hurt both the people and their families who are left in limbo, as well as US competitiveness. The H-1B visa was created to hire foreign workers in specialty occupations, to bring, quote, the best and the brightest to work here. For the H-1B visa holders who want to stay, a green card is the next step. And without it, people remain tied to an employer and are often limited in their ability to bring their full talents to the United States. Further waiting decades for permanent residency, I know this for a fact, creates uncertainty and can hurt people's livelihoods in the United States. A few months ago in a hearing, we heard from Dr. Cora, a nephrologist at the Poplar Bluff Regional Medical Center, who has dedicated his career to serving people in an area of rural Mississippi with a severe doctor shortage. After waiting for over a decade for his green card, he invested his own money to open an urgent care clinic in his community. This was impossible previously because H-1B holders are not permitted to own a business. Dr. Kura's story is one of a million, and we are fortunate that it is an American story because Dr. Kura did contemplate moving to Canada, which would have offered him a roadmap to citizenship much more quickly. But we can't afford to assume that others will make the same choices that Dr. Kura did. And that's why it's so important that we advance the EAGLE Act today to address the discriminatory 7% per country cap, which creates, as Chair Lofgren said, lengthy backlogs for people coming from particular countries, such as India and China, who wait decades before receiving green cards. The bill also offers benefits for those on H-1B status and the families of green card holders, and it includes provisions to ensure that employers pay the actual wages for that job as they would a similar job with similar duties. It also increases the per capita limit on family-sponsored visas from 7% to 15%, making it easier for families to reunite. The last thing I want to say is I've heard a lot from the other side about all the people who are coming here without documentation, all the people that are coming to the borders. What I would say to you is that the United States over the last several decades has taken away more and more legal pathways for people to come to this country, or they've made it impossible. As the chairwoman said, if you have to wait 100 years to get your visa approved or your green card status approved, then that's not really a legitimate pathway. And so what we have to understand is we need a system that functions with legal pathways for people to come to this country and to actually be able to know that they're going to get those applications processed in their lifetime, in their children's lifetime, before their children age out. Because once you age out, you move to a different category, which then truly becomes impossible if you're a child. So I just think it's important, if you're so concerned about people who are here without documented status, then give us legal pathways. And this is one of those very important legal pathways that can be and should be provided. And I thank the Chairwoman Lofgren, for all of her work on this issue. I'm proud to support this act, and I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. For what purpose is Ms. McBath seek recognition?
Thank you, Chairman Nadler. I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you. I'm so pleased that we are finally marking up this bill today, the Bipartisan EAGLE Act. This bill really provides long-awaited relief for millions of immigrants that are currently waiting for employment-based visas. These populations, they're our neighbors. They're our friends, they're our co-workers, and they deserve to be invested in like they have for years. They've invested in our country. And, we can do that. We can do that by passing the EAGLE Act, which really works really hard to eliminate the per country caps on employment-based immigrant visas and raise the per country caps on family-sponsored immigrant visas from 7% to 15%. Congress passed strikingly similar legislation just last Congress with an overwhelmingly bipartisan vote of 365 to 65. And a modified version of the bill was passed in the Senate by unanimous consent. This is an issue that we can all agree on, and an issue that we can swiftly solve by voting yes on this bill, voting yes on HR 3648. In my district in Georgia, there are over 162,000 residents who were born outside of this country. In our towns of Johns Creek and Chamblee, about a third of the population are made up of immigrants. I know from firsthand experience that these individuals make up the heart and soul of my district and our nation. Yet because of decades-long caps on per county visas, countries such as India and China, which have the largest populations in the world and provide some of the highest skilled workers to the United States, are largely restricted from sharing some of their brightest minds with us. The average individual from China waiting for an employment-based green card, for example, must wait 44 years. And the average employment-based green card wait time for someone from India is up to 90 years. I don't have to tell you that many people will go their entire lives, as Representative Jayapal has expressed. They will go their entire lives waiting for this application to be processed before ever receiving it. It's absolutely imperative that we pass this bill. This bill is good for families, it's good for communities, and it's good for the future of this country. So in spite of everything that we've heard tonight thus far, I truly urge my colleagues to vote yes. Vote yes on HR 3648. Vote yes on this bill, because it is a matter of life and death for many, many people. And I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. For what purpose does Mr. Johnson seek recognition?
Johnson of Louisiana? Yes.
Mr. Johnson of Louisiana.
You were looking at the other Johnson, sorry. An amendment at the desk.
Gentlemen, the clerk will report the amendment.
I reserve a point of order.
Point of order is reserved.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to HR 3648, offered by Mr. Johnson of Louisiana, page 3.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read, and the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Immigration and Nationality Act, or INA, provides green cards for many categories of individuals, including ministers and non-ministers in religious vocations and occupations. These green cards are provided through the employment-based fourth preference EB4 green card category that is reserved for certain special immigrants. The INA defines 13 categories of certain special immigrants under EB4 and includes religious workers. HR 3468 eliminates the annual per-country cap for employment-based green cards, including EB4. For other categories of visas, the bill includes a 9-year transition to prevent all green cards from going only to nationals of the 2 countries with the most individuals in the green card wait list for the next several years. However, HR 3468 does not include the EB4 category in the transition period. Thus, whatever special immigrants are on the EB4 wait list will immediately receive green cards to the detriment of any special immigrants from any other countries, including those working in religious vocations. I just think we can't allow religious workers to be shut out of the programs provided by the INA in favor of other immigrants. And that's why I've introduced a very simple amendment that would allow EB4 visas the same 9-year phase-in that other employment-based visas are afforded in the bill. Religious freedom and religious practice are vital to the framework of this country, and those principles are fostered by allowing ministers and religious leaders from other countries to come here. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Does the gentlelady insist on her point of order?
I do not. This is a germane amendment, but I would like to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
And I oppose the amendment. This legislation that we have before us is based on the Fairness for High School Immigrants Act, which was co-sponsored by over 100 of our Republican colleagues, some of whom sit on this committee. As we know, the bill was then modified to add a longer transition period for certain employment-based categories, as well as the additional H-1B transparency and accountability provisions. That was carefully drafted to include provisions that make modest but meaningful changes to our immigration system. The transition period for the employment-based provisions, EB 2 and 3, are important so that individuals from other countries who have expressed concern that they might be disadvantaged are not. The fourth preference employment-based immigrant visa category is a very broad category that encompasses 11 different groups. They include special immigrant juveniles. Now, special immigrant juveniles, and a lot of people don't know what that is, if you have been abandoned by a parent, you can go into state court and a judge will make a determination whether in fact your parent has abandoned you, and if so, you are eligible for special immigrant juvenile status. I will note that with that status comes a prohibition on ever petitioning for the parent who's abandoned you, but it's really to take care of abandoned children because they're subject to the 3 and to the per country cap, we have this whole cohort that a judge has determined has been abandoned by their parent, and yet there's a backlog, and these abandoned children are in limbo. That is not, and honestly, the SIJ visa was stuck into fourth preference without a lot of thought. It doesn't, you could argue it doesn't belong in there at all, but that's where it is. We have not had any input from the religious community that also has religious workers in this category, and I have been a huge advocate for the religious worker program in past Congresses and remain so, but we have not had that kind of input from our faith-based community. I think this is would have placed hardship, additional hardship on these juveniles who've been abandoned. I don't think that's good policy, and I don't want, therefore, to put them into this transition period, because this bill provides a solution for these kids. And as we know, most, I don't want to say all of these kids, but a very large number of these children who've been abandoned come from the 3 countries in Central America. And so the per country cap and the limitation is jamming them up. And I just don't think that's the kind of system. We never envisioned it, really. When we wrote the special immigrant juvenile provisions, nobody ever assumed that we would have these young people adjudicated abandoned who would then be in some long limbo. That's not a good policy position to land at, and the bill does resolve that problem. I think we should stick with what's in the bill, and the amendment would unwind it, and therefore I would urge that we not support the amendment. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. Does anyone else seek recognition? If not, the question occurs on the amendment.
On the amendment.
All in favor say aye. Opposed, no? No.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. And the amendment is not agreed to. Are there any further amendments? For what purposes, Mr. Tiffany seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will
I
report the
reserve
amendment.
a point of order.
Point of order is reserved.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 3648, offered by Mr. Tiffany of Wisconsin.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read, and the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment would simply put some teeth behind an existing law that directs the executive branch to halt the issuance of visas in what are known as recalcitrant countries. These are countries which refuse to allow us to repatriate their criminal aliens, which leaves thousands of criminal aliens from those countries here in the United States. Due to legal precedents that prevent us from detaining these individuals indefinitely, this can result in situations where foreign criminals who should have been removed from our country released into unsuspecting communities. China is perhaps the world's largest offender in this regard. Foreign governments in Latin America, the Caribbean, Africa, Central Asia, Southeast Asia, and the Middle East have also been uncooperative, and many others are classified as being at risk of noncompliance. The principle behind my amendment is a very simple one. If a foreign government refuses the repatriation of their own citizens, why would we want to bring more of them here, knowing we may never be able to remove them? If these countries wish to get off the naughty list, all they must do is cooperate with us and take back their own criminals, instead of using the United States as a dumping ground for foreign scofflaws. And just to give you an example, remember the Mariel boat lift from Cuba back in about 1980, when we had thousands of people that came across the water to Florida, and Fidel Castro emptied his prisons. And we have something kind of like that right now, a Mariel boat lift, only they're going across the Rio Grande. If you read the stories this week, they're selling their homes in Havana and places like that in Cuba, hoping to be able to get here as the promise of Title 42 going away stands before the world, and the terrible public policy change that we're about to make here in the United States. And so I ask for a yes vote on this amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. Does the gentlelady insist on her point of order?
I do not. It is a germane amendment, but I would like to strike the last one.
The gentlelady is recognized.
I think this is an amendment that we should not adopt, and I'll tell you why. There are countries that from time to time have refused to accept their nationals who are being removed from the United States. And that's infuriating, and the gentleman is correct. There is a U.S. Supreme Court decision indicating that you cannot indefinitely hold people in custody, the Zadias case, if their home country won't accept them. That's problematic, and there are ways to press these sort of scofflaw nations into acting. But I think the H-1B visa prohibition actually is an incentive for countries to be recalcitrant. Because here's what's happening in these countries. People who are graduating from the best research universities they have to offer are then leaving. It's a brain drain from these countries. They're coming to the United States, and the H-1B visa is one of the few where Congress has provided what's called dual intent, so that unlike a visitor's visa or a student visa, where you have to prove to the visa issuer that you have an intent to return to your home country, for the H-1B visa, you can have dual intent. You can have intent to come temporarily, but have a long-term goal of staying permanently to the United States. And most of the people who are in the EB 2 and 3 category are actually who are the recipients of visa petitions by their employers. Well over 90% are in the United States lawfully working. So this is a brain drain to some extent from some other countries, and it benefits the United States. Some of the most important technology developments in the United States have happened by individuals who are who've come either to study and then stay on H-1Bs and then as permanent residents. So I think the incentive is exactly opposite for the recalcitrant countries, and I do think that this is an issue that the committee has not talked about, and I know the gentleman has raised this on another bill, and it might be something that we should discuss more seriously after this markup, because I do think, what is the pressure point if you've got a bad actor country that won't accept people who are being removed? Probably their diplomats and their diplomatic staff denying visas to the offspring of totalitarian leaders. That will get to them, not denying H-1B visas to geniuses who want to come and build companies in the United States. So I urge that we do not approve this amendment, but I will look forward to working with Mr. Tiffany at a later date on what we might craft with the help, I think, of the Foreign Affairs Committee, because they have a piece of that jurisdiction as well that might actually work as an incentive for these recalcitrant nations. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back.
Chip, will you yield me? Okay, Dan's got it.
Who seeks recognition?
I do, Mr. Chairman. Bishop.
For what purpose does Mr. Bishop seek recognition?
To strike the last word on the.
Gentleman is recognized.
And I yield my time to the gentleman from Wisconsin.
Thank you, Mr. Bishop. So, first of all, today we created a loophole for the Virgin Islands, which we're going to drive a whole bunch more people through. We saw it in the Mariana Islands, and now we're going to create one closer to home here in the Virgin Islands. And now we heard the quote just now. I know this is infuriating, And there's ways in which we can press this issue, and we can discuss this more seriously in the future. I've got an amendment here at the table that can address this problem. And there are a few different ways, as a gentle lady from California said, that we can press this issue for other countries. Why not put another tool in the toolbox? Why not have another way here to deal with these recalcitrant countries? And this amendment comes to you in good faith. And once again, we're being told, let's get this bill done, and I give you a promise of the future. It kind of sounds like budgeting here in the capital of Washington, D.C., doesn't it? Isn't that how the promise always goes?
I would just submit to the gentleman that it sounds like immigration law for the past 40 years, as illustrated by the discussion, the exchange of comments between me and the gentlelady from Texas. There have been constant amnesties followed that were connected to promises of security and security provisions, and those never come to pass. Security's never done. It's another amnesty, it's another liberalization without those things being done.
Would the gentleman yield?
Let me yield back to the gentleman from Wisconsin because I interrupted his point.
And I suspect that the gentle lady from California thinks she's making a legitimate offer here, but it really rings hollow when we've seen this time after time. I mean, this is kind of Charlie Brown and Lucy, where the football gets pulled away every time. And forgive me if I'm jaded in regards to this, and I know you always address these things with us in a soft-spoken manner, and with a sound of sincerity, but sincerity comes with actions. And we have not seen those actions be sincere. I yield back to the gentleman from North Carolina.
Would the gentleman yield?
I will momentarily, but I must say before doing that, it seems to me, and I understood the gentlelady from California's point about, that you might actually deter countries who want to be recalcitrant from letting people come here because it'd be a brain drain. Therefore, we need to sort of figure out how to work around them. It does seem to me to be most reasonable to expect this program to work well for the United States with countries with whom we have a good relationship. And if you have a country that's a scofflaw, I would rather start with the presumption that that's not a good country to work with. And with that, I'll yield to the gentlelady from California.
Thank you. I thank the gentleman for yielding. Let me be clear. I don't think this amendment is an effective measure for the problem that's been identified. So I'm happy not to work with Mr. Tiffany in the future on this, but I just think this is not going to solve the problem that he has identified, and perhaps I wasn't as clear about that as I should have been. I thank the gentleman for yielding.
Thank you. Reclaiming my time, I yield to the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Tiffany.
Well, unfortunately, we heard it. We heard it just now. I'm happy not to work with you, Congressman Tiffany. And sitting in the majority, authoring many of these resolutions, I would expect some magnanimity where you would say, okay, I am genuine, that I do want to work with you.
Would
But
the
what I
gentleman
hear
yield?
is that we're happy not to work with you. I yield back to the gentleman.
If the gentleman would yield, I just want to be clear. My offer to work was sincere. My sincerity was questioned. So I don't want to impose upon the gentleman, and I wanted to make that clear. I yield back.
The time of the gentleman has expired. For what purposes does Ms. Jackson Lee seek recognition?
To strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Some of us, like Ms. Lofgren, have been working on the H-1B fix, if you will, for a good while, and I want to applaud. I'm glad there are many of us who are co-sponsor of this legislation. because there have been a great improvement, and it does respond to the enormity of the backlog and the dissatisfaction, frankly, between H-1B holders, H-1B persons like the individual that Ms. Ross cited, who had to be deported back to their country, the loss of talent. So I'd like to just emphasize, Mr. Chairman, some of the positive nuances that I think have been included in this legislation. For example, the Department of Labor is directed to establish a searchable internet website for the posting of H-1B positions within 180 days, requiring employers to provide public notice of new H-1B positions on the newly established page. Online job postings must include the occupational classification, job title, education, experience requirements, salary or wage, benefits offered, location, and the employer's process for applying for a position, all to the extent of not taking advantage of the applicant. But in addition, prevailing wage requires employers to submit to the DOL documentation of methodology used to establish a prevailing wage for a prospective H-1B employee. As relates to American workers who sometimes have thought that the H-1B holders would be in place of them, advertising for the position must not state that the position is only open to H-1B workers or that H-1B workers will be given preference. The employer has not primarily recruited H-1B workers for the position. The employer agrees to submit forms W-2 filed on behalf of H-1B employees if requested by DOL. Another aspect that sometimes have proven difficult. The ending of foreign media abuse prohibits individuals who are classifiable as representative of the foreign press, radio, film, or other foreign information media, and who are seeking entry into the United States for that purpose from receiving an H-1B visa or being admitted into the United States. In the backdrop of our constant nemesis in Russia and all the efforts that it has made to interfere with our presidential elections and other aspects of our quality of life, I think this is an important aspect that is a nuance to this particular legislation. In addition, it expands whistleblower protection to preclude employers from taking, failing to take, or threatening to take or fail or take a personnel action against a whistleblower. So it goes on in other aspects of it, specifies that an employer who violates a whistleblower protection shall be liable to an employee for lost wages and benefits. It requires USCIS to share with DOL information submitted by employers in H-1B petitions that indicates the employer is not complying with H-1B program requirements. So there are aspects of this legislation that cross the T's and dot the I's of some of the elements that I think make the actions more honest, if you will, by employers, and also to work with the Department of Labor and to protect certain elements, including a whistleblower saying to the American worker that H-1B is not given preference, and then taking care of the enormity of the backlog, which I think has been so serious over decades. And so I'm asking my colleagues, Republicans, to join in a constructive response to H-1B, to capture talent, to protect American workers, to protect whistleblowers, and to ensure that taxes are paid and the H-1B program works well. With that, I'm happy to yield to the gentlelady.
I thank her for her comments. I would just note on the point that she's made on the backlog, the Congressional Research Service did an analysis of wait times, and they say, the CRS says that the estimated wait time for EB-2 green card in fiscal year 2021 for applicants born in India, this is from CRS, is 214.4 years. That's how long you will wait to get your visa number. Obviously, you will be dead before that happens. So when I hear people say, get in line, well, people in line are going to be dead before the visa number comes up. And
Time of the gentlelady has expired.
Their children old.
Does anyone else seek recognition? If not, the question occurs on the bill, on the amendment. On the amendment, all in favor say aye. Opposed, no? No? In the opinion of
No.
the, in the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to.
Recorded vote.
A recorded vote is requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Nadler.
No.
Mr. Nadler votes no. Ms. Lofgren.
No.
Ms. Lofgren votes no. Ms. Jackson Lee. Ms. Jackson Lee votes no. Mr. Cohen. Mr. Johnson of Georgia.
No.
Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes no. Mr. Deutsch. Ms. Bass. Ms. Bass.
Bass votes no.
Ms. Bass votes no. Mr. Jeffries.
Jeffries votes no.
Mr. Jeffries votes no. Mr. Cicilline.
No.
Mr. Cicilline votes no. Mr. Swalwell. Mr. Swalwell.
No.
Mr. Swalwell votes no. Mr. Liu.
No.
Mr. Liu votes no. Mr. Raskin.
No.
Mr. Raskin votes no. Ms. Jayapal.
No.
Ms. Jayapal votes no. Ms. Stimmings.
No.
Ms. Stimmings votes no. Mr. Correa.
Correa votes no.
Mr. Correa votes no. Ms. Scanlon.
Scanlon votes no.
Ms. Scanlon votes no. Ms. Garcia.
No.
Ms. Garcia votes no. Mr. Neguse.
No.
Mr. Neguse votes no. Ms. McBath.
McBath votes no.
Ms. McBath votes no. Mr. Stanton.
No.
Mr. Stanton votes no. Ms. Dean.
Dean votes no.
Ms. Dean votes no. Ms. Escobar.
No.
Ms. Escobar votes no. Mr. Jones.
No.
Mr. Jones votes no. Ms. Ross.
Ross votes no.
Ms. Ross votes no. Ms. Bush.
Bush votes no.
Ms. Bush votes no. Mr. Jordan. Mr. Jordan. Mr. Jordan votes yes. Mr. Shabbat.
Aye.
Mr. Shabbat votes aye. Mr. Gomert. Mr. Isa.
Aye.
Mr. Isa votes aye. Mr. Buck. Mr. Gates. Mr. Gates votes aye. Mr. Johnson of Louisiana.
Aye.
Mr. Johnson of Louisiana votes aye. Mr. Biggs.
Aye.
Mr. Biggs votes aye. Mr. McClintock. Mr. McClintock votes aye. Mr. Stube. Mr. Tiffany.
Aye.
Mr. Tiffany votes aye. Mr. Massey. Mr. Massey votes aye. Mr. Roy. Mr. Roy votes aye. Mr. Bishop. Mr. Bishop votes aye. Ms. Fishbach.
Aye.
Ms. Fishbach votes aye. Ms. Sparts. Mr. Fitzgerald. Mr. Fitzgerald votes aye. Mr. Benz.
Benz votes aye.
Mr. Benz votes aye. Mr. Owens.
Are there any members who wish to vote who haven't voted yet? Clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, there are 14 ayes and 23 noes.
The amendment is not agreed to. For what purpose does Mr. Bishop seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report the amendment.
I reserve a point of order.
Point of order is reserved.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read, and the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. After the, on page 16 of the bill is a subdivision titled Ending Media Abuse of H-1B, And immediately after that, on page 17, line 2, after line 2, I propose to an addition to also end the abuse of the program by the Chinese Communist Party. In 2020, the New York Post columnist Sohrab Ahmari wrote detailing how Facebook was using Chinese nationals holding H-1B visas to help censor content from its users. He reported that there were at least half dozen Chinese nationals who were working on censorship for the hate speech engineering team at Facebook. One of the staffers was a research scientist who earned his master's degree in computer engineering from the Chinese Academy of Sciences in Beijing. Another earned his bachelor's and master's degree in computer science from Jilin University in Northeast China. Another engineer previously worked for the communist-backed conglomerate Huawei. Now, how in the world did it come to pass that we're using the H-1B program, or allowing the H-1B program's use by the CCP or by CCP-tied individuals taking advantage of non-immigrant visas in order to censor content on Facebook? But that's, let's see, let me also momentarily say, I'd like to seek unanimous consent to submit that column for the record, Meet Your Chinese Facebook Censors, in the New York Post.
Without objection.
But that's not all. Senate Homeland Security and Government Affairs Committee investigation revealed that non-immigrant visas, including H-1Bs, are being used for China's Thousand Talents program. The State Department conducted a review, said its review process leads to less than 5% of reviewed applicants being denied a visa, nor do states systematically track visa applicants linked to China's talent recruitment plans. And so, question again, why are we allowing the use of the H-1B program to allow CCP-affiliated individuals to come to the U.S. to recruit and buy off U.S. persons on behalf of the Chinese Communist Party? In 2008, the Chinese government announced its plan to recruit top overseas researchers and to eventually bring their talents and expertise to China to benefit the government. It took the FBI 10 years to recognize that the Chinese government talent programs posed a threat to the U.S. academic community and federal research grants. In 2015, the FBI identified the Chinese talent plans as a known vector of a non-traditional threat. They used the H-1B program. Former Representative Mike Rogers wrote a column in The Hill that the CCP had infiltrated nearly every aspect of our society. He cited the Thousand Talents program, recruiting U.S. professors, researchers, and scientists to share documents and knowledge with the CCP in exchange for cash. We all know about Fang Fang. The American Spectator, between 2014 and 2019, Chinese state-owned entities donated at least $315 million to U.S. universities, including $88 million coming from Chinese contractors and universities that assist the Chinese military in defense research. There are several details there. 200 CCP-affiliated donors gave to dozens of American universities, but some of those colleges and universities did not disclose those donations. Columbia University accepted $1 million to set up a Confucius Institute. University of California, Irvine, and Northwestern University accepted a combined $4 million donation for research from a company controlled by a Chinese defense contractor that reverse engineered Chinese military planes from stolen F-35 designs. Michigan accepted a $1.3 million donation from Harbin University, China's MIT, which the Treasury Department had put on its ban list. So I'll also ask unanimous consent to submit those 3 articles that I made reference to, Mr. Chairman.
Without objection.
Bottom line, it seems to me to be almost beyond arguing that it makes sense, as this program is being amended, to provide, as this amendment does, that it may not be used to issue a visa to an alien who is affiliated with or is a member of the Chinese Communist Party, and that the Secretary of Homeland Security may not admit such an alien pursuant to these provisions. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Does the gentlelady insist on her point of order?
I do not insist on the point of order. It is germane, but I would like to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
I strike the last word in opposition to this amendment, and let me tell you why. First, the amendment is unnecessary and falls short of the more nuanced provisions of law that exist in the Immigration and Nationality Act. If you take a look at Section 212, excludable aliens, people are not eligible for admission if they have been a member of or affiliated, this is in 212D, 3CD, with the communist or any other totalitarian party, domestic or foreign. You're inadmissible. Except there's an exception for involuntary membership. The clause of excluding Communist Party individuals shall not apply to an alien because of membership or affiliation if the alien establishes to the satisfaction of the consular officer when applying for a visa or to the AG when applying for admission that the membership or affiliation is or was involuntary or is or was solely when under the age of 16 years of age by operation of law or for the purposes of obtaining employment, food rations, or other essentials of living, and whether necessary for such purposes. So basically, the law does what the gentleman's amendment purports to do, but it makes sure that if you were a conscript or you were forced, there's an exception for that. And I think that is important.
Would the gentlelady repeat her citation, please?
Yes, it's 212(3)D. A3D. There is value to the United States in getting very smart people from all over the world into our universities and into our business establishment. The Bipartisan National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence has stated that the best way to counter China is to attract their best and brightest talent to the United States. In fact, the Chinese Communist Party sees brain drain as a very serious national security threat to them. And our ability to attract and retain talent is an obstacle to their ambitions. I think this amendment, since there is a phenomena in China where individuals are involuntarily made members of the Communist Party, they would be treated as if they were full-fledged communist believers. So I don't think, I'm guessing, that there's disagreement. Really, we don't want people who are at odds with us, people who are our adversaries, to be admitted. The gentleman doesn't want that, and I don't want that. But I think the nuanced provision in the law, which provides for exceptions for people who were children or who were forced in some way, is better than the amendment which he has offered. And in terms of productivity and innovation for the U.S., the smartest people getting here and becoming Americans is an important strength of the United States of America. So I would urge opposition.
Would the gentlelady yield?
Let me finish. I would urge opposition to this amendment as redundant, except and unnecessary, and not quite as nuanced as the existing law. And yes, I'd be happy to yield to the gentleman.
I think the gentlelady, and I'll try to squeeze this in, the gentlelady cited section 212A3D.
Mm-hmm.
And if my expert advice from behind the dais is correct, 212A3D of the INA only applies to immigrants, not non-immigrants. And H-1B visa holders are non-immigrants. So in fact, what that points up is, I think you have a gaping hole that needs to be fixed by this amendment, no?
No, I don't believe so, because if you go back to the it talks about his admission, if you go to the very first paragraph in section 212, entitled Excludable Aliens, it's 8 U.S. Code 1182. Classes of aliens ineligible for visas or admission, and
The
it's
time of the
not
gentleman
limited.
has expired.
That was my time, I think.
Oh, I'm sorry, the time of the gentlelady has expired. For what purpose does Mr. Shabbat seek recognition?
Move strike last word, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you. I rise in support of the gentleman from North Carolina's amendment. As I mentioned in my earlier statement in opposition to the underlying legislation, my biggest issue with this legislation is that it invites individuals sent by the Chinese Communist Party to infiltrate our society and ultimately receive a green card. Mr. Bishop's amendment would help curb that possibility. By precluding members of the Chinese Communist Party from attaining an H-1B visa, we would greatly reduce the potential for China's subverting our government and ultimately doing harm to the American public or to American businesses. The Trump administration limited visa access for CCP, Chinese Communist Party journalists. Why shouldn't we do the same for H-1B visa applicants from the CCP? It's my understanding that 2 H-1B visas have been used as an alternative to the I visa, the journalism visa, because it can be renewed every 3 years, presumably with the future possibility that the worker will be sponsored for a green card. Now, I happen to be the former chairman and current ranking member of the Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on Asia and the Pacific. And China is, the name of the subcommittee suggests, they fall squarely within our jurisdiction. And China is doing everything in its power to weaken the United States. It's stealing our intellectual property. It's working with the Russians in attempting to destroy Ukraine. And it's sending members of the Chinese Communist Party into the United States to spy and otherwise infiltrate our government. We know that's happening. China is our principal rival, our adversary, whether we want to admit it or not. And we have tried, we thought that by trading with them and allowing them into WTO and giving them what used to be called most favored nations, which then became normal trade relations. Essentially what we did, we thought they'd become more like us if they were able to work with us and trade with us and invest here and we invest there. But just the opposite has happened. Their behavior has been abhorrent. And now, as we all know, they're working with Vladimir Putin to undermine and to try to take over Ukraine. And a lot of innocent people are dying there. So Mr. Bishop, his amendment is a good amendment. It's really a necessary amendment and ought to be supported by anyone who takes the threat of the Chinese Communist Party, the PRC, People's Republic of China, seriously. And I hope that there'll be some bipartisan support here because I know both sides at least act like they think Chinese Communist Party is a threat. Let's look at this vote and how it goes and see if it's true or not. And I yield back.
I need some time.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose does Mr. Roy seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
I would just note this was a similar debate that we had earlier with respect to the U.S. Virgin Islands provision. I'd share the interpretation of both our counsel and Mr. Bishop and do support Mr. Bishop's effort to amend, and it would yield to him.
I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I think this is, first of all, the committee's not in order. Mr. Chairman, the committee's not in order. Great, thank you, Madam Chairman. And to the point, the discussion that we were having, I've been, in the interim, looking at INA Section 212, codified at Title 8, 1182 of the United States Code. And it is headed Classes of Aliens Ineligible for Visas or Admission. It's very interesting. If you go through each of these subsections, 1, 2, 3, etc., each of the categories begins any alien. So the exclusions are any alien under 1, health-related grounds. Under 2, criminal and related grounds. I'm trying to find the appropriate introductory language there. Let me just keep going. Security and related grounds. Any alien who's a consular officer, terrorist activities, any alien. These exclusions are applying to any alien in every case. But when you get over to 3D, it suddenly changes to any immigrant who is or has been a member of or affiliated with the communist or any other totalitarian party or subdivision or affiliate thereof, or domestic or foreign, is inadmissible. Couple points. One observation is it doesn't specify the Chinese Communist Party. It specifies a Communist Party. In case the Democratic Party is not yet aware of what Donald Trump made the whole world aware, the Chinese Communist Party is the preeminent threat in the world to the United States. So that is point enough to warrant a separate provision, even if redundant. And here, I think the advice given by staff counsel is exactly right. The language is jarringly different. It isn't covering every alien category, it's covering immigrants. And this is a non-immigrant visa. So I can't understand. In fact, staff, I think, is back there having a disagreement about it or discussing their way through the language, as I've just attempted to do as a newcomer to it. But it's sufficiently obvious that there's an omission there, there's a difference in categorization, that it makes no sense not to cover the Chinese Communist. If we can take care of a media abuse, can we not take care of abuses by the Chinese Communist Party? Can my Democrats majority not join me in doing that? And with that, I yield the time back to Mr. Roy.
And I would just echo that this was related to the exchange we had earlier, right, on the U.S. Virgin Islands. And I was making the point, not as eloquently as the gentleman from North Carolina, and share the exact same concern and interpretation of our counsel, and look at it and that distinction where it says immigrant as opposed to the other sections. And I think clarifying it, both in the U.S. Virgin Islands, which I think we agreed to have a conversation about, and then I think the gentleman here is making the same point, and I agree with him, but I'll yield to the gentlelady.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. I believe, I understand the point you're making. I think as applied, this section has always applied to aliens seeking admission as well as people seeking immigrant visas. We, it's been a long time since I taught immigration law, but we will do further research on this subsequent to this bill. I think we will reach out to our Department of Homeland Security career people and see whether my understanding is correct or not correct, and if so, we'll have ample opportunity to make corrections.
Reclaiming my time, yielding to the gentleman from North Carolina.
Well, I thank the gentlelady, but if we're going to mark up this bill, and as opposed to withdrawing it from the calendar, if we're going to mark up this bill, then let's take care of the abuse from the Chinese Communist Party.
If I may, if the gentleman would further yield, the point of the existing statute, which is there are exceptions for people who have been coerced or who were involuntarily entered as children. I think that is important, and it is absent in the gentleman's amendment. Thank you for yielding.
I'm going to yield back to me. Yep. I suggest that the greater problem is the Chinese Communist Party.
Co-sponsor. Yield back.
Time has expired. Are there, Mr. Biggs, are you seeking recognition? Where is he? Ah, there you are. Indeed. Up there in a little box. You're recognized.
Yes, indeed, Madam Chair. Thank you. I too had.
Are you moving to strike the last word, or do you have an amendment, sir?
Yes, moving to strike the last word.
Okay,
yes,
you're
thanks.
recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. And I too, like Mr. Bishop, had decided to pull out the immigration law handbook here to look at his amendment, and he's right. I think he's right 100%. And I can't say it any better than he has, but I will ask a few questions. You might determine that they're rhetorical, but I would like an answer. I mean, because what we just heard was that, even though the language is different in this section, as it refers to immigrant as opposed to an alien, that all the adjudicators routinely just treat them all the same. I don't know that I accept that. And it certainly would be sloppy on the part of adjudicators because you do have specific statutory language dealing with immigrants, which is why Rep. Bishop's amendment is so vital. But if they are treating them the same, I would be curious to know how many people have actually been rejected pursuant to this section here, this subsection here that Representative Bishop is referring to. Anybody know? My guess is nobody, which is why you need the amendment. So I stand firmly behind Representative Bishop. This amendment is absolutely critical. It's necessary I'm struggling to understand why if we're marking up a bill, why we keep saying, well, look, we're going to get to this. We'll address this in the future. We'll address this down the road. Well, now there's so many things that there's been commitments to address down the road. We probably ought to pull this bill, rework it, and see if we can come to some kind of consensus on this. But there's stuff that has to be fixed here. This is one of them.
Would the gentleman yield? Would the gentleman yield?
And with that, I'm going to yield.
the gentleman
back to the
yield?
chairman.
Mr. Biggs, would you yield to me, please?
Yeah, I'll yield to the gentleman from North Carolina.
I think the thing that's pretty remarkable about this, as I think about it, is not only that this bill comes to markup without this being dealt with, but the very same argument, I'm told, I don't think I was here, I was briefly away from the hearing, but Mr. Roy, in an amendment you raised in the previous bill, this exact issue was presented to the majority. And it took it coming up again and my doing a quick read through the statute and articulating the language even to give some pause to the majority. I can't imagine in the current circumstances that the United States faces and the geopolitical circumstances of the world that you would not seal off Chinese Communist Party's abuse of this program tighter than a drum. And I yield back to Mr. Biggs.
Did the gentleman
I
yield?
thank the gentleman. So if I can just continue on with my thematic for just a second longer. We're talking about the Chinese Communist Party. Now, what you need to understand about that is it is bigger than the entire population of the United States of America. And in China, if you're not a member of the Chinese Communist Party, you're virtually treated as a second-class citizen. You're out on the edge. This is a massive problem for us because the Chinese Communist Party has been infiltrating and spying on us and stealing our technology, stealing our intellectual property, and views us not as an economic competitor, but as a Cold War type of adversary. I cannot believe that we're not addressing this and that the majority is stumbling over this. I think we need to address this. Tonight's the night to deal with it, or else pull the bill and let's come back tomorrow or next week or the weekend, whenever we're back in session, and let's resolve the issue. But I think this amendment is so timely, and it's necessary. I support it, and I yield back to my time.
For what purpose does Ms. Jackson-Lee seek recognition?
Right Again Act, HR 1924. I was detained in another hearing and was not able to get back for the vote, and I would have voted resoundingly aye for Mr. Jeffries' Expunge Act. I'd like that placed in the record at the appropriate place.
Without objection.
I think I'm on a UC, am I?
Yes.
Thank you. Would have been happy to yield, but I'm on a UC.
The question occurs on the amendment. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. No. In the opinion,
No. No.
in the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The noes have it.
I request a recorded vote.
Recorded vote is requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Nadler.
No.
Mr. Nadler votes no. Ms. Lofgren.
No.
Ms. Lofgren votes no. Ms. Jackson Lee.
No.
Ms. Jackson Lee votes no. Mr. Cohen. Mr. Johnson of Georgia.
No.
Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes no. Mr. Deutsch. Ms. Bass.
No.
Ms. Bass votes no. Mr. Jeffries.
No.
Mr. Jeffries votes no. Mr. Cicilline.
No.
Mr. Cicilline votes no. Mr. Swalwell.
No.
Mr. Swalwell votes no. Mr. Liu.
No.
Mr. Liu votes no. Mr. Raskin.
No.
Mr. Raskin votes no. Ms. Jayapal.
No.
Ms. Jayapal votes no. Ms. Stimmings.
No.
Ms. Stimmings votes no. Mr. Correa.
Correa votes no.
Mr. Correa votes no. Ms. Scanlon.
Scanlon votes no.
Ms. Scanlon votes no. Ms. Garcia.
No.
Ms. Garcia votes no. Mr. Neguse.
No.
Mr. Neguse votes no. Ms. McBath.
McBath votes no.
Ms. McBath votes no. Mr. Stanton.
No.
Mr. Stanton votes no. Ms. Dean.
Dean, no.
Ms. Dean votes no. Ms. Escobar.
No.
Ms. Escobar votes no. Mr. Jones.
No.
Mr. Jones votes no. Ms. Ross. Ms. Bush. Mr. Jordan. Mr. Jordan votes yes. Mr. Shabbat.
Aye.
Mr. Shabbat votes aye. Mr. Gomert. Mr. Isa.
Aye.
Mr. Isa votes aye. Mr. Buck. Mr. Gates.
Aye.
Mr. Gates votes aye. Mr. Johnson of Louisiana.
Aye.
Mr. Johnson of Louisiana votes aye. Mr. Biggs.
Aye.
Mr. Biggs votes aye. Mr. McClintock. Mr. McClintock votes aye. Mr. Stubbe. Mr. Tiffany. Mr. Tiffany votes aye. Mr. Massey. Aye. Mr. Massey votes aye. Mr. Roy. Aye. Mr. Roy votes aye. Mr. Bishop. Aye. Mr. Bishop votes aye. Ms. Fishbach.
Aye.
Ms. Fishbach votes aye. Ms. Sparts. Mr. Fitzgerald. Mr. Fitzgerald votes aye. Mr. Benz.
Yes.
Mr. Benz votes yes. Mr. Owens.
Mr. Chairman, this is Corey Bush. How am I recorded?
Ms. Bush, you are not recorded.
Bush votes no.
Ms. Bush votes no.
Mr. Chairman, how am I recorded?
Mr. Deutsch, you are not recorded.
No.
Mr. Deutsch votes no.
Are there any other members who wish to be recorded who haven't been recorded? Clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, there are 14 ayes and 23 noes.
The amendment is not agreed to. The question now occurs on the amendment nature of a substitute. This will be followed immediately by a vote on final passage of the bill. All those in favor respond by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment nature of a substitute is agreed to. Reporting quorum being present, the question is on the motion to report the bill H.R. 3648 is amended favorably to the House. Those in favor respond by saying aye. Aye. Opposed?
Aye.
Opposed? Opposed, no.
No.
The ayes have it, and the bill is ordered reported favorably. Recorded vote has been requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Nadler.
Aye.
Mr. Nadler votes aye. Ms. Lofgren.
Aye.
Ms. Lofgren votes aye. Ms. Jackson Lee.
Aye.
Ms. Jackson Lee votes aye. Mr. Cohen. Mr. Johnson of Georgia. Mr. Johnson of Georgia. Mr. Johnson of Georgia. Mr. Deutsch.
Aye.
Mr. Deutsch votes aye. Ms. Bass.
Aye.
Ms. Bass votes aye. Mr. Jeffries. Mr. Jeffries. Mr. Cicilline.
Aye.
Mr. Cicilline votes aye. Mr. Swalwell. Mr. Liu.
Aye.
Mr. Liu votes aye. Mr. Raskin.
Aye.
Mr. Raskin votes aye. Ms. Jayapal.
Aye.
Ms. Jayapal votes aye. Ms. Stimmings.
Aye.
Ms. Stimmings votes aye. Mr. Correa.
Correa votes aye.
Mr. Correa votes aye. Ms. Scanlon.
Scanlon votes aye.
Ms. Scanlon votes aye. Ms. Garcia.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Ms. Garcia votes aye.
Everybody, please remember to mute your microphone unless you're voting. Ms. Garcia.
I said aye.
Ms. Garcia votes aye. Mr. Neguse.
Aye.
Mr. Neguse votes aye. Ms. McBath.
McBath votes aye.
Ms. McBath votes aye. Mr. Stanton.
Aye.
Mr. Stanton votes aye. Ms. Dean.
Aye.
Ms. Dean votes aye. Ms. Escobar.
Aye.
Ms. Escobar votes aye. Mr. Jones.
Aye.
Mr. Jones votes aye. Ms. Ross.
Aye. Ross votes aye.
Ms. Ross votes aye. Ms. Bush. Mr. Jordan. Mr. Jordan votes no. Mr. Shabbat.
No.
Mr. Shabbat votes no. Mr. Gomert. Mr. Issa.
No.
Mr. Issa votes no. Mr. Buck. Mr. Gates.
No.
Mr. Gates votes no. Mr. Johnson of Louisiana.
No.
Mr. Johnson of Louisiana votes no. Mr. Biggs.
No.
Mr. Biggs votes no. Mr. McClintock. Mr. McClintock votes no. Mr. Stubbe. Mr. Tiffany. Mr. Tiffany votes no. Mr. Massey. Mr. Massey votes no. Mr. Roy. Mr. Roy votes no. Mr. Bishop. Mr. Bishop votes no. Ms. Fishbach.
No.
Ms. Fishbach votes no. Ms. Sparts. Mr. Fitzgerald. Mr. Fitzgerald votes no. Mr. Bentz.
No.
Mr. Bentz votes no. Mr. Owens.
Mr. Johnson of Georgia.
Mr. Chairman, how am I recorded?
Mr. Jeffries, you are not recorded.
Jeffries votes aye.
Mr. Jeffries votes aye.
Johnson of Georgia votes aye.
Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes aye.
Are there any other members who haven't been recorded who wish to be recorded? Clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, there are 22 ayes and 14 noes.
The ayes have it, and the bill is amended as ordered reported favorably to the House. Members will have 2 days to submit views. Without objection, the bill will be reported as a single amendment in the nature of a substitute incorporating all adopted amendments, and staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes. This concludes our business for today. Thanks to all of our members for attending. Without objection, the markup is adjourned.